Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This is a story that took place nearly 10 years ago, but it feels as vivid in my mind as if it happened yesterday. I was fresh out of college, still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. At the time, I was working odd jobs, saving up just enough to explore places that called to me. This particular summer, I found myself in a sleepy coastal town on the northern Atlantic coast. It was the kind of place where the fog rolled in thick and low every morning, where the air always carried a faint tang of salt, and the nights were so quiet you could almost hear the ocean breathe. The town itself was charming in its own way. Most of the buildings were old, their wooden facades weathered by years of exposure to salty winds. The streets were narrow and cobblestoned, with small shops that closed as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Despite its quaintness, the town held an unspoken rule. No one talked about the lighthouse. I wasn't alone on this trip. My friend Tom had decided to join me. We'd been close since high school, and he shared my thirst for adventure. He was the pragmatic one, the type to question everything and keep us grounded whenever I let my curiosity get the better of me. Together, we rented a small, cozy cottage on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was comfortable, a place to sleep and store our gear after long days spent exploring. Our routine was simple. Mornings began with strong coffee from the only cafe in town, where the owner, an older man with a heavy accent, never failed to warn us about wandering too close to the lighthouse. Bad things happen there, he'd say, his voice low and serious. At first, we brushed it off as a local legend, a way to spook tourists. After all, every old town seemed to have its ghost stories. Afternoons were spent hiking along the rocky coastline, marveling at the jagged cliffs and the crashing waves below. Sometimes, we'd come across tide pools teeming with life, or an abandoned fishing boat that looked as though it had been there for decades. The lighthouse, perched on a hill in the distance, always seemed to be watching us. It was an imposing structure, its white paint peeling and its windows dark, even during the day. One evening, we decided to head to the pub in town. It was one of the few places open late, a dimly lit spot where locals gathered to share stories and gossip over pints of ale. That night, the conversation inevitably drifted toward the lighthouse. A man sitting at the bar, his face lined with age and his eyes shadowed, warned us not to go near it. Strange things happen there, he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. People hear voices, see lights that shouldn't be there. Some folks who've gone up there never came back. Tom and I exchanged a glance, both intrigued and skeptical. We thanked the man and made our way back to the cottage, the cool night air wrapping around us as we walked. By then, the moon was high, casting its pale light over the landscape. From where we stood, we could see the lighthouse in the distance, its silhouette stark against the dark sky. Back at the cottage, we stayed up late, talking about the stories we'd heard. Tom was dismissive, chalking it up to superstition and small-town folklore. But something about the way the locals spoke of the lighthouse unsettled me. It wasn't just fear. It was as though they carried a deep, unspoken knowledge they couldn't share. The first few days passed without incident, and the lighthouse remained a distant, silent presence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an old building. There was something about it, something I couldn't quite put into words. At night, when the town fell silent and the fog rolled in thick, I'd stand by the window, staring out at the faint outline of the lighthouse in the distance. It felt like it was waiting for something or someone. And so, despite the warnings and the growing unease in my chest, I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. It was our fourth evening in the town when the first strange event occurred. Tom and I had spent the day hiking further than usual, pushing past the familiar trails to explore more secluded spots along the coastline. By the time we returned to the cottage, The sun was already setting, casting long shadows over the landscape. The air was colder than it had been the previous nights, carrying a biting edge that made my skin prickle. We settled in for the evening, cooking a simple dinner on the small stovetop in the kitchen. Tom was recounting one of his ridiculous college stories, the kind we'd told 100 times before, when I noticed it for the first time, a faint light coming from the direction of the lighthouse. "Hey, do you see that?" I interrupted, pointing out the window. Tom turned to look, squinting at the distant silhouette of the lighthouse. Sure enough, there was a faint, flickering glow emanating from one of the upper windows. It wasn't steady, like a normal light. It pulsed irregularly, like an old bulb struggling to stay lit. "Huh," Tom muttered, shrugging. "Probably just someone working on the place. Maybe fixing it up." I nodded, but something about it didn't sit right with me. We hadn't seen a single person go near the lighthouse since we'd arrived, and the locals seemed adamant that it was abandoned. The thought of someone being up there now, as darkness fell, felt off. We tried to move past it, chalking it up to something mundane, but the light kept drawing my attention. After dinner, as we sat in the small living room playing cards, I caught myself glancing out the window repeatedly. The flickering glow was still there, faint but persistent. "You're obsessing," Tom said, tossing down his cards. "Let it go, man. It's just a light." But I couldn't. Something about it nagged at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, the light went out. One moment it was there, faint but steady, and the next it was gone, leaving the lighthouse as dark and foreboding as ever. "That's weird," I muttered, standing by the window. "What's weird?" Tom asked, brushing his teeth in the tiny bathroom. "The light just stopped. Maybe they finished whatever they were doing," he said, his voice muffled by the sound of running water. I didn't respond, staring out into the darkness. Without the light, the lighthouse looked even more ominous, its silhouette sharp against the faint glow of the moonlit clouds. I finally turned away, shaking off the unease. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just my overactive imagination. The next morning, we decided to head into town for breakfast. The cafe owner greeted us with his usual gruff demeanor, pouring our coffee without a word. As we sipped our drinks, I casually mentioned the light we'd seen the night before. The cafe fell silent. Every conversation stopped, and every set of eyes turned toward us. The tension was palpable, like a heavy weight pressing down on the room. "What light?" the owner asked, his voice low. I hesitated, suddenly unsure if I should have brought it up. There was a light in the lighthouse. It looked like someone was up there. "No one's been up there in years," the owner said firmly. "It's not safe." "Maybe someone's fixing it up," Tom suggested, trying to lighten the mood. The owner shook his head. "No one goes up there, and you do well to stay away too." The rest of the cafe murmured in agreement, their faces a mixture of concern and something else, fear. We left shortly after, the weight of their stares following us out the door. As we walked back to the cottage, Tom was unusually quiet. "Do you think they're just messing with us?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Maybe," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "But they're definitely hiding something." That night, the light returned. It was stronger this time, no longer faint and flickering, but steady and bright. It illuminated the window like a beacon, cutting through the darkness with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a distance. Tom and I stood by the window, staring at it in silence. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew the light wasn't normal. Then, something even stranger happened. The light started to move. At first, it was subtle, like a trick of the eye. But as we watched, it became clear that the glow wasn't stationary. It shifted from one window to another, moving methodically as if someone, or something, was carrying it through the lighthouse. Tom swore under his breath, stepping back from the window. "Okay, that's creepy." I didn't respond, my eyes fixed on the light. It stopped moving for a moment, hovering in one window, and then it went out. We waited, our breaths held, but the light didn't come back. The lighthouse was dark again, its shadow looming over the coastline like a silent sentinel. "That's it," Tom said, his voice shaking slightly. "We're going up there tomorrow." I nodded, a pit of dread forming in my stomach. Whatever was happening at the lighthouse, it wasn't something we could ignore anymore. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cottage, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning, we set out early, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its whitewashed exterior stark against the gray sky. As we approached, the air seemed to grow colder, and the sense of unease that had been lingering since our arrival deepened. Neither of us spoke as we climbed the hill toward the lighthouse, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. When we reached the base of the structure, I stopped, staring up at it. The windows were dark and empty, the door weathered and slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, just as the locals had said. But I knew better now. Something, or someone, was inside. The closer we got to the lighthouse, the heavier the air seemed to feel, as though the atmosphere itself was thickening with tension. The wind had picked up, rushing past us in cold, sharp gusts that tugged at our jackets and carried with it the faint smell of salt and something else, something metallic. I noticed how quiet Tom had gotten, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a tense, almost hesitant silence. The lighthouse door, weathered and slightly ajar, creaked faintly as we approached. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before pushing it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the sound echoed through the structure like a warning. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a pungent mix of mildew, rotting wood, and an earthy dampness that seemed to cling to everything inside. The air was colder here, almost unnaturally so, and every breath felt like inhaling a chill that settled deep in my lungs. Inside, the lighthouse was as abandoned as it looked from the outside. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in thick, undisturbed layers from the ceiling. The floor was littered with debris, old papers, shards of broken glass, and what looked like the remnants of seaweed that had somehow found its way inside. Tom shone his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the dim light that filtered in through the grime-covered windows. "Looks like no one's been here for decades," he said, his voice echoing slightly. "Then how do you explain the light?" I asked, my voice lower than usual. He didn't answer, and I didn't push him. Instead, we began to explore, moving cautiously through the lower level. The first unsettling discovery came as we neared what appeared to be a storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and when Tom pushed it open, we found rows of rusted tools hanging on the walls. Most of them were covered in a thick layer of dust, but one stood out, a large wrench that looked as though it had been recently used. It was clean, its metal surface free of the corrosion that covered everything else. "That's weird," Tom said, reaching for it, but stopping short, as though thinking better of it. We exchanged a glance, but didn't linger. There was something about the room that felt wrong, as though we were intruding on a space that didn't belong to us. As we moved up the narrow spiral staircase to the second level, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The steps creaked loudly under our weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The second level was more unsettling than the first. It was mostly empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and a large, dusty mirror propped against the wall. The mirror was cracked, its surface warped in places, and when I glanced into it, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, out of the corner of my eye. I turned sharply, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Tom replied, his flashlight darting around the room. I hesitated. "Nothing." "Never mind." We continued to the third level, where the light had been emanating from the night before. The air grew colder as we ascended, and the sound of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, as though the building itself was amplifying it. The third level was empty at first glance, but as we moved further in, we found something that stopped us both in our tracks. A small wooden table in the center of the room, with a single candle burning on it. The flame was steady, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was no one else in the room, and no sign of how the candle had been lit or how it had remained burning for so long. Tom swore under his breath, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Okay, this is officially creepy. I didn't respond, my eyes fixed on the candle. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that made my skin crawl. Then we heard it, a faint sound, like the creak of a floorboard, coming from above us. We froze, our breaths caught in our throats, and listened. The sound came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably the sound of footsteps. "There's someone else here," I whispered, my voice trembling. Tom nodded, his face pale. "Let's go." But before we could move, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the realization hit. I didn't want to know what was waiting for us upstairs. Reluctantly, we continued to the top level, the staircase groaning under our weight. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time we reached the top, it felt like we were standing in a freezer. The room at the top of the lighthouse was empty, save for a large, rusted lantern hanging from the ceiling. It wasn't lit, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Then we heard it again, the sound of footsteps, but this time they were coming from below us. Tom and I exchanged a panicked glance, our minds racing. There was no way anyone could have gotten past us on the staircase, and yet the footsteps were unmistakable. "Let's get out of here," Tom said, his voice shaking. We descended the staircase as quickly as we could, the sound of footsteps following us the entire way. By the time we reached the bottom, we were both out of breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we stepped outside, the cold night air hit us like a slap in the face. The lighthouse loomed behind us, dark and silent once more. Neither of us spoke as we made our way back to the cottage, our minds racing with unanswered questions. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have, something that wasn't meant to be found. The next day, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just our imaginations, amplified by the eerie setting and the locals' warnings. But deep down, I knew better. The events didn't stop there. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences grew more frequent and more intense. The final night at the cottage started like any other, with Tom and me attempting to shake off the strange occurrences we had experienced at the lighthouse. But the air that evening felt heavier, almost oppressive. The once charming sounds of the waves crashing against the shore now seemed ominous, as if the ocean itself was warning us to leave. The first sign that something was wrong came when Tom's flashlight, which had been sitting on the kitchen counter, suddenly flickered to life on its own. It cast long, erratic beams of light around the room, illuminating shadows that seemed to move unnaturally. "Did you turn that on?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No," Tom replied, his eyes fixed on the flashlight as though it might attack. Before we could react further, the flashlight died again, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the faint moonlight filtering through the windows, casting eerie shapes across the walls. Then we heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the front door. It was slow and deliberate, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted us to know they were there. "Don't open it," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Tom nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in the air. A low, guttural sound filled the room, a noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my eyes darting around the room. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, the kind that felt alive. Then, without warning, the front door burst open with a violent force, slamming against the wall and making us both jump. But there was no one there. Instead, a cold, unnatural wind blew into the cottage, extinguishing the small fire we had lit earlier and scattering papers and debris across the room. The sound of the wind was deafening, like a chorus of whispers overlapping and intertwining into a cacophony of unintelligible words. "Tom, we need to leave," I said, grabbing his arm. He nodded, but before we could move, the wind stopped just as suddenly as it had started. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. Then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely discernible in the dim light. But as our eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer, a tall, gaunt shape standing in the doorway, its outline shrouded in a mist that seemed to emanate from its very being. Its eyes, or what I assumed were its eyes, glowed faintly, like dim embers in a dying fire. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating and malevolent. Tom let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in the process. I stood frozen, unable to look away from the figure. "Who? What are you?" I managed to choke out, though my voice sounded small and insignificant in the oppressive silence. The figure didn't respond, but the room grew colder still, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was as though the figure was projecting its emotions onto us: anger, hatred, and something else I couldn't quite place. Without thinking, I grabbed Tom's arm and pulled him toward the back door. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But as we moved, the figure shifted. It didn't walk or glide, it simply seemed to appear in a new position, blocking our path. Its form began to change, becoming less human and more something else. Its limbs elongated unnaturally, and its head tilted at an impossible angle. The faint glow of its eyes grew brighter, and I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest, as though it were trying to reach into my very soul. Tom screamed, a sound filled with pure terror, and I felt his grip on my arm tighten. "We're not going to make it," he said, his voice breaking. "Yes, we are," I shouted, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed the lantern we had found at the lighthouse and hurled it at the figure. To my shock, the glass shattered against it, and for a brief moment, the room was filled with a blinding light. The figure let out a horrific, inhuman screech, its form flickering like a faulty projection. Tom and I took the opportunity to run, bolting out of the cottage and into the cold night. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the cliff, where the lighthouse stood like a silent sentinel against the chaos we had just escaped. But as we caught our breath and looked back toward the cottage, we saw the figure standing in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It didn't move, but its presence was a clear message. We weren't welcome here. I turned to Tom, my voice shaking. "We need to leave this place. Now." He nodded, and without another word, we made our way back to the car. The drive away from the lighthouse felt surreal, the events of the night replaying in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But as we put more distance between ourselves and the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't done with us, that it had left its mark in a way we couldn't yet understand. The road leading away from the lighthouse was shrouded in a thick fog that seemed almost alive. Every shadow cast by the headlights felt like it was reaching toward us, and the tension in the car was palpable. Tom gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes following us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. It wasn't until we were miles from the lighthouse that the suffocating pressure seemed to ease. I felt like I could finally breathe again, but the sense of safety was fleeting. "What the hell was that?" Tom finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice shaky. "But whatever it was, it wasn't human." We didn't dare stop driving until we reached a motel several towns away. It was a small, run-down place, but at that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. The buzzing fluorescent sign and the faint smell of stale coffee in the lobby were a welcome contrast to the oppressive darkness we had left behind. Once we checked in, we sat in the room, neither of us willing to sleep. The events of the night played over and over in my mind, each detail more horrifying than the last. The figure, the unnatural cold, the oppressive feeling of dread, it all felt too real to dismiss as a trick of the mind. Tom paced the room, his hands running through his hair repeatedly. "We should call someone," he said finally. "The police, a priest, anyone who might know what to do." "And tell them what?" I shot back, frustration laced with fear. "That we were chased out of a haunted lighthouse by a shadowy figure? They'll think we're insane." Tom stopped pacing and sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "I just want to forget this ever happened," he muttered. But forgetting wasn't an option. The next morning, we packed our bags and checked out of the motel. The daylight should have brought comfort, but it only served as a stark reminder of how close we had come to something we couldn't understand. We decided to return home without discussing it further. Neither of us wanted to risk another night near that cursed place. On the drive back, we tried to distract ourselves with the radio, but every song seemed to echo our unease. When we finally reached the city, I dropped Tom off at his apartment. Before he got out of the car, he turned to me and said, "We're not going to tell anyone about this, right?" "Right," I agreed. But the unspoken truth hung heavy between us. We weren't staying silent out of embarrassment or fear of disbelief. We were staying silent because some part of us feared that speaking about it would give it power, that acknowledging it might invite it back into our lives. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to normal life. Work, errands, and the mundane routines of everyday existence became my focus. But the lighthouse was always there, lurking at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. At night, I would wake up to the sensation of being watched, my room filled with a cold that had no source. Strange things began happening around my apartment. Lights flickering, objects moving from where it left them, and the faint sound of tapping at my windows, even though I lived on the third floor. I avoided talking to Tom, afraid that hearing his voice might bring back the memories I was trying so hard to suppress. But one day, he called me. "I need to know if it's happening to you too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The cold, the noises, the feeling," he said. "It's like it didn't stay behind. It's here, with me." Hearing him say it out loud made it real. Desperate for answers, I started researching the history of the lighthouse. What I found only added to my unease. I shared my findings with Tom, but instead of comfort, it brought more fear. "What if it's not just the lighthouse?" he asked. "What if it's us now? What if we brought it with us?" The question lingered, unspoken but ever present, as we both tried to move on with our lives. Months passed, and the incidents became less frequent, but they never stopped entirely. I started sleeping with the lights on, and I avoided looking into mirrors at night, afraid of what I might see. One day, I received a postcard in the mail. It was blank, except for one word scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Leave." There was no return address, but I knew who it was from. When I called Tom to ask if he had sent it, his voice cracked. "I got one too," he said. We didn't speak for long, but the call left me shaken. It was clear that whatever had haunted the lighthouse had left its mark on us, and it wasn't going to let us forget. Eventually, I decided to move. I packed up my belongings and left the city, hoping that putting distance between myself and the lighthouse would finally bring me peace. Tom did the same, and though we didn't keep in touch, I often wondered if he was able to escape the lingering shadow that had followed us. As for me, the nightmares continued, but the incidents became less frequent over time. The tapping stopped, the cold receded, and I began to feel like myself again. But every now and then, when the night is particularly still, I hear it, a faint, deliberate tapping, as though something is reminding me that it's still there, waiting. Time has a way of dulling the sharp edges of fear, turning even the most vivid memories into hazy fragments. Years have passed since Tom and I left the lighthouse. And life has moved on in many ways. I've changed jobs, moved to a new city, and tried to leave that chapter of my life behind. But the truth is, some scars never fully heal. The lighthouse remains a constant presence in my thoughts, an unwelcome guest that visits in the quiet moments when my mind drifts. The memories of that night, the shadows, the oppressive cold, the sense of being hunted, are as clear now as they were then. No matter how much time passes, I can't convince myself that it was all in my head. One night, as I was settling into bed, I found myself staring out the window at the city lights. The bustling streets below offered a sense of safety, a reminder of the normalcy I had worked so hard to rebuild. But as I looked at the faint glow of a street lamp, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the same kind of cold I felt at the lighthouse. I closed the blinds quickly, convincing myself it was just a draft or an overactive imagination. But in my gut, I knew better. The past doesn't stay buried, no matter how far you run or how much you try to forget. I've often wondered if anyone else has dared to visit the lighthouse since that night. Has someone else experienced the same terror? Or is it sitting there, dormant, waiting for its next visitors? Part of me feels a sense of responsibility, as though I should warn people to stay away. But how do you warn someone about something they can't see or understand? For me, peace is harder to come by. I've tried therapy, journaling, even talking to a priest, but nothing has erased the lingering sense of unease. Sometimes I find myself looking up articles about hauntings, reading forums where people share their experiences with the paranormal. It's not for comfort or validation, it's more like a compulsion, a need to understand. The stories I read all share a common thread, an overwhelming sense of dread, the feeling of being watched, and the inability to escape. It's strange, but in a way, those stories make me feel less alone. They remind me that others have faced the unexplainable, that the world is full of mysteries we may never fully grasp. But then there are moments when I wish I'd never gone to the lighthouse at all. Ignorance, as they say, is bliss. One evening, as I was cleaning out an old box of belongings, I came across the journal I kept during that time. Flipping through its pages, I was struck by how much detail I had recorded. Every strange sound, every fleeting shadow, every moment of terror, it was all there, written in my own hand. Reading it brought the memories flooding back, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to truly feel the fear again. My hands trembled as I read the last entry. We left, but I don't think it's over. I don't think it ever will be. I closed the journal and shoved it back into the box, sealing the lid as if that could contain the memories. Looking back, I realized that what haunts me the most isn't the figure we saw or the chilling events of that night. It's the questions that remain unanswered. What was it? Why was it there? And why did it let us leave? Maybe some things are better left unknown. As I sit here writing this, the night outside is eerily quiet. The street lamp casts a faint glow, and the shadows seem to stretch a little longer than usual. I tell myself it's nothing, that the past is behind me. But there's a part of me, a small, stubborn part, that wonders if it's still out there. Watching, waiting. So if you ever find yourself near the coast, and you see a lighthouse standing alone on the edge of a cliff, take my advice. Don't go in. Some doors are better left unopened. It was the summer of 2012, and I was fresh out of college, eager to start my new job at a local hospital. The building had been around for decades and carried the weight of history in its walls. Located on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio, the hospital was a blend of modern wings and older sections that felt like stepping into the past. Some called it vintage, others whispered that it was haunted. I didn't believe in ghosts back then. The stories were nothing more than urban legends to me, things you tell each other late at night to pass time. As someone who prided himself on being logical, I dismissed every tale of phantom footsteps, shadowy figures, or lights that flickered on their own. It was just a building, after all. When I joined the hospital staff, I was assigned to the night shift. My job was pretty straightforward. Assist the medical team, check patient records, and occasionally transport supplies to different wards. The team I worked with was small but welcoming. There was Sam, a senior nurse who had been with the hospital for over 20 years, Brian, a security guard who spent most of his time scrolling on his phone, and Maria, an intern like me, always cheerful and full of energy despite the late hours. The night shift started quietly. The hospital had a calming stillness to it after dark, almost serene. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the hum of machines provided a constant background noise. My routine involved a lot of walking through long, dimly lit corridors. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a sense of purpose. One of the first things I noticed about the hospital was the older wing. Unlike the rest of the building, which had been renovated, this section remained frozen in time. Its walls were painted a pale yellow that had faded to a sickly way, and the tiled floors were cracked and worn. The smell of antiseptic lingered heavily there, mixed with an earthy dampness. Nobody used the old wing much. It was mainly storage now, with shelves filled with outdated medical equipment, dusty gurneys, and boxes of records. Still, it connected to the main hospital, and occasionally I had to pass through it to deliver supplies or retrieve something. I remember my first night venturing into that wing vividly. Sam had asked me to fetch a box of syringes from the storage room. I took a flashlight with me, even though the lights were functional. The air felt colder there, heavier somehow, but I chalked it up to bad ventilation. The creak of the floor beneath my shoes echoed in the silence, and I caught a faint whiff of something metallic, like rust or old blood. When I returned to the main wing, Maria greeted me with her usual smile, teasing me for looking pale. "The old wing getting to you already?" she joked. I laughed it off, blaming the chill. But as I settled back into my routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that place wasn't right. Over the next few weeks, I became more comfortable with the job, though the old wing always gave me pause. Sam would sometimes share stories during our breaks, how nurses in the 80s reported seeing figures standing at the end of the hall or hearing their names whispered when no one was around. Brian, on the other hand, dismissed the tales entirely. "This place is old, that's all. Creaky floors, bad wiring. It's nothing supernatural," he'd say, leaning back in his chair. Despite my skepticism, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease whenever I was assigned to retrieve something from that wing. The air always seemed colder, and the shadows felt deeper, more alive. But I told myself it was all in my head. One night, as I walked through the main corridor, I passed by a display case filled with black and white photographs of the hospital from decades ago. The images showed doctors and nurses standing proudly in front of the building, patients sitting in wheelchairs, and staff gathered for group shots. One photo in particular caught my eye. It was dated 1947 and showed a small group of nurses in crisp white uniforms. What struck me was the background. It was the old wing, unmistakable with its unique arched windows. I stared at the photo, feeling a strange connection to the place. These people had walked the same halls I now roamed. Their lives had intersected with mine, separated only by time. I carried on with my shift, the photo lingering in my mind. It was just a building, I reminded myself. Just a job. But that night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. It was as if the hospital itself was watching me, waiting. The first sign that something was wrong came during a quiet Tuesday night shift. It was around 2 a.m., the time when the hospital was at its emptiest. The phone hardly rang, and the few patients we had were all asleep. Even Maria had gone home after her shift, leaving only Sam and me to man the floor. Brian, our security guard, was doing his rounds, and I found myself walking the long hallways alone, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I had just delivered some medical supplies to the and was heading back toward the central wing when I noticed something strange. At first, it seemed so small, so insignificant, that I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. The hallway lights flickered. Nothing unusual there. Old buildings tend to have electrical issues, especially one as aged as ours. But this wasn't just a casual flicker. The lights dimmed, then brightened again, as if they were trying to make some sort of strange, subtle point. I glanced around, wondering if I had somehow triggered the issue by walking too close to the sensors. But I hadn't. The lights had always been temperamental, and this was just another quirk of the hospital, or so I thought. I continued walking, but my pace slowed when I noticed a shadow dart across the hall. I stopped, looking ahead into the dimly lit corridor. The shadows from the overhead lights stretched far and long, but there was something about the way they moved, something that didn't belong. I froze, staring down the hallway. The faint sound of footsteps echoed back to me from the far end of the hall. At first, I thought it was just Brian on his rounds, but when I looked at my watch, I realized he should have been heading in the opposite direction, near the security office. The footsteps continued, slow, measured, as if someone or something was walking just ahead of me, but I could see nothing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably one of the older hospital residents still wandering around, confused by the late hour. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more unsettling it became. I turned the corner, the sound of the footsteps still lingering in the background. They grew louder, closer, until, suddenly, they stopped. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should keep moving, but a strange instinct told me to turn back. There was no reason for the steps to stop, not unless. A sharp clink broke the silence, echoing in the corridor. It sounded like metal against metal, like a wheelchair being rolled along the tile floor. But when I looked down the hall, nothing was there. No wheelchairs, no nurses. Just the usual dark corners of the old wing. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every fiber of my being screamed to leave, but I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't even explain why the situation felt so wrong. After a few tense seconds, I pulled myself together, deciding to finish my rounds and check in with Sam. But as I walked away, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I made it back to the nurse's station, Sam was sitting behind the desk, scrolling through a medical journal. He didn't look up immediately, so I decided to break the silence. "Hey, Sam," I said, my voice unsteady. I swear I heard footsteps in the hallway, but no one was there. "You know anything about that?" He gave a low chuckle, his eyes still glued to the pages in front of him. "The old wing gets to people sometimes. You get used to it. A lot of weird stuff happens around here late at night." I frowned, trying to shake off the lingering unease. "Weird stuff? What kind of stuff?" Sam set the journal down, finally looking up at me. "You'll hear things, footsteps, whispers, things that shouldn't be there. Some nurses think it's the spirits of patients who never left. Honestly, I don't know what to think. But it's part of the job. You get used to it or go crazy." I stared at him, trying to read his expression. He didn't seem like the type to joke about something so eerie, yet I still couldn't bring myself to believe it. It was just an old building, I told myself. It had to be. "Maybe you're right," I said with a weak smile. "I guess I'm just tired. I'll head out in a bit." But Sam's face had grown serious, his eyes darkened by some unspoken memory. "Just be careful, okay? Don't stay in the old wing too long after dark. You'll hear things, see things, and you'll start asking yourself if it's all real or if you're just losing your mind." I didn't understand him then, but the unease in his voice stuck with me. Sam wasn't the type to believe in superstition or ghost stories. He was a man of science and medicine. Yet, the way he spoke about the old wing, the way his voice lowered when he mentioned it, made me question everything. I nodded and went back to my duties, dismissing the conversation as nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment. But as the night wore on, something inside me stirred. I couldn't shake the thought that Sam knew something I didn't, something that I wasn't ready to face. The strange occurrences didn't stop. In fact, they intensified as the days went by. Every night felt like a reminder that something was wrong with the hospital. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when the same unsettling events started happening to others, it became clear. Something wasn't right. Sam and I continued our shifts, but every night felt heavier. The long hallways stretched before us, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a constant reminder of the strange energy that lingered in the air. The old wing, where the incidents had first started, became the focal point of our unease. No matter how much I tried to distract myself with work, it was always there, that feeling that something was watching. It all started small at first. A door slamming shut in the distance when no one was around. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but enough to send chills down your spine. One night, I heard the unmistakable sound of a woman crying out for help. But when I rushed toward the sound, it was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. No patient had been in the hallway, and no one had even been near. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind, but when I mentioned it to Sam, he only gave a knowing look. He didn't say much, but the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his lips pressed into a thin line, told me he was thinking the same thing. He'd been here longer than I had, and I could tell by the way he avoided certain rooms, certain halls, that he had seen more than he was willing to admit. On the fourth night of the strange happenings, things escalated further. It was just after midnight, and I had taken my usual round through the dark, narrow corridors. The hospital was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes the smallest noise feel deafening. I was walking past the janitor's closet when I noticed something strange, an old rusted wheelchair sitting in the corner of the hallway. The chair had never been there before. I was sure of it. I stopped, staring at it. The metallic frame of the wheelchair gleamed under the dim overhead lights, and the frayed, torn cushion on the seat looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As I stood there, an unsettling feeling crawled over me. Something about that chair felt wrong. It was as if it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for me to find it. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard a soft creak behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but the chair was still there, unmoved, as if nothing had happened. But then I heard it again, this time, louder. The unmistakable sound of the chair scraping against the floor. It was moving. I didn't wait to see any more. I bolted down the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't care if I looked like a fool. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I found Sam at the nurse's station, and when I told him what had happened, he didn't seem surprised. He leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck as though this was all too familiar. "I told you," he said, his voice low and steady. "The old wing. It's not right." I could see the fear in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. "What do you mean? What's going on here, Sam? Is there something you're not telling me?" He hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're starting to see it too. I thought I was the only one who felt it. I've heard things, seen things that I can't explain. But it's not just us. Other staff members too. You know the old morgue on the third floor? People have been hearing strange noise coming from there at night. There are rumors about the place, about what happened there." I could tell that Sam wasn't about to elaborate, so I pressed on, trying to understand. "What rumors? What happened in the morgue?" He shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not the first time something like this has happened. This place, it has a history. People have died here, sure. But there are things that shouldn't be forgotten, things that shouldn't be left behind." I wasn't sure what he meant, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to ignore it. I had to figure out what was happening, whether it was real or just in my head. That night, I decided to explore the old morgue myself. The third floor was colder than I remembered, and the dim, flickering lights only made it worse. As I made my way down the corridor, the silence seemed to stretch for miles. The rooms on this floor were abandoned, their windows covered with thick curtains that kept the outside world from creeping in. The morgue was at the far end of the hall, and the closer I got, the heavier the air became. I reached the door to the morgue, its rusty hinges groaning as I pushed it open. The smell of old dust and metal hit me like a wall. Inside, the room was dim, with only the faintest sliver of light filtering in through a small window at the far end. There were old stainless steel tables, covered in dust, and a row of metal drawers lining the walls, each one designed to hold a body, though none had been used in years. As I stepped further inside, the air grew colder. I could hear the faintest sound of something scraping against the floor, like the dragging of something heavy. I froze, listening intently. The sound was coming from behind one of the large stainless steel tables. I slowly crept forward, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the table, I was too afraid to look at what lay behind it. But I had to know. My hand trembling, I reached out and slowly moved the table aside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, was the rusted wheelchair, the same one I had seen in the hallway. It was sitting there, motionless, just as it had been before. But this time, there was something more. Something darker. A soft, cold breath brushed against the back of my neck, and I knew, without a doubt, that I was not alone. The cold breath at the back of my neck was all the confirmation I needed. I wasn't alone in the morgue anymore. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn and run, to get as far away from that room as possible. But my legs felt frozen in place, as if some invisible force had clamped down on me, forcing me to face whatever was behind me. I slowly turned around, my heart hammering against my chest. My eyes scanned the dimly lit room, looking for the source of the breath. But there was nothing visible, at least. It was the emptiness that was the most terrifying thing. The cold, oppressive silence that hung in the air, broken only by the distant sound of my own breathing. But then, I saw it. The wheelchair. It had moved. Not only had it moved, but it had turned slightly, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. The metal frame glinted in the dim light, and the torn fabric of the seat seemed to shift slightly, as though it were alive. A low, almost inaudible sound began to fill the room. It was a scratching noise, like fingernails running along metal. I could feel my body shaking, my palms slick with sweat. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the rest of the world. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me there. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, even as the chair slowly rolled forward across the cold floor. Inch by inch, it crept toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. My breath was ragged as I backed away, my eyes never leaving the chair. But then I felt it, a sharp tug at my sleeve. My body froze, and I turned my head just in time to see a shadow dart past me in the corner of my eye. Panic surged through me, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The figure was there, standing just beyond the threshold of the door. It was dark, too dark to make out any features, but I could feel it. The presence, the coldness, the malevolent energy that radiated from it. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its form impossible to discern. And yet, I knew it was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my skin. I tried to call out, but no sound came. My throat had closed up, and I couldn't make a noise, no matter how hard I tried. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. And then, in the corner of my vision, I saw the wheelchair again. It had moved closer, so close that I could feel its presence just behind me. The scraping sound was louder now, closer. It was like fingernails dragging along the floor, slow and deliberate. I had to get out of there. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned to flee, but as I did, I heard a voice, low, raspy, barely above a whisper. "Help me." The words cut through the silence like a blade, sending a chill down my spine. My body froze once more, my breath caught in my chest. "Help me." The voice was closer now, so close I could feel it on my ear, as if someone were right behind me. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror. There, in the doorway, the figure stood once more, but this time it was no longer just a shadow. A face, pale, gaunt, and twisted, emerged from the darkness. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow, like two empty voids staring back at me. I couldn't look away. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room grew heavier, thicker, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The shadows twisted and writhed, as if alive, and the wheelchair moved again, slowly, silently, toward the figure. It was as if the room itself was alive, pulling me toward the unknown. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. It raised one hand, long, bony fingers reaching toward me, and I could feel its coldness in the air, like a deathly chill that froze me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, unable to move, unable to escape. "Help me." The voice rasped again, its tone hollow, desperate. And then, in that moment, I understood. It wasn't a request for help. It was a warning. Suddenly, the air around me seemed to shift, the shadows closing in tighter, the temperature dropping even further. The figure raised its hand higher, and I could see it now, a jagged scar running down its face, splitting its skin like a tear in fabric. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't some lost soul wandering the halls. This was something else, something darker, something that had never left this place. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of the air pushing against me, suffocating me. My chest tightened and my vision blurred. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, trapped by some invisible force. And then the figure lunged. Everything happened in an instant. It wasn't just the figure. There were more, shadows, faces, forms emerging from the darkness all around me, reaching out with skeletal hands, their mouths open in silent screams. I could feel them closing in, their cold breath brushing against my skin, their fingers brushing my shoulders, my arms, my face. It was suffocating. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The figure was gone, the shadows retreated, and the room returned to its eerie stillness. I stood there, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. Was it real? Had it been a hallucination? The question echoed in my mind, but there was no answer. I didn't know what was real anymore. But I knew one thing for certain. Something was wrong with this place. And no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. The silence that followed the terrifying encounter was almost worse than the chaos. My body was still trembling as I staggered backward, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The shadows that had once seemed so real now lay still, like the aftermath of a storm. There was no sign of the figure, no evidence of the cold presence that had filled the room moments before. Just the oppressive quiet that hung heavy in the air. I couldn't stay here. I knew that much. I looked around the morgue, the weight of my fear anchoring me to the spot. The wheelchair, still in the same spot it had been before, was now utterly still. The darkness of the room seemed to be suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. My heart was racing, my breath shallow and quick, as I fought the overwhelming urge to flee. The fear that had gripped me just moments ago still lingered, coiling around my chest like an iron vice. I backed away from the shadows, toward the exit. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just experienced, what I had just witnessed. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by stress and fatigue? The logical part of me wanted to believe that, wanted to convince myself that the horrors I had seen were nothing more than figments of my imagination. But the terror in my bones told me otherwise. The sudden, sharp sound of a door creaking open snapped me back to the present, my heart skipping a beat. I whipped my head around, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the empty corridor beyond. I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed through the abandoned hallways as I made my way toward the exit, each step feeling like it took me farther from the nightmare I had just endured. But no matter how fast I ran, the unease lingered. It clung to me like the cold fingers of the darkness itself. I could still feel the chilling presence from the morgue, as if it was following me just beyond my reach. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep moving, to get out of this place before it consumed me entirely. Finally, I reached the exit. My hand trembled as I gripped the handle, and for a moment, I paused. The finality of the door, of leaving, was almost too much to bear. Would I be free? Or was this just the beginning? The question burned in my mind, but I couldn't stay to find out. I pushed open the door, stepping into the night air, the cool breeze hitting my face like a slap of reality. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled out into the open, away from the hospital, away from the horrors within. But even as I stood there, in the safety of the night, I could still feel the presence. The dark energy that had filled that morgue seemed to follow me, lurking in the edges of my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever I had encountered, whatever had haunted that place, was still out there, waiting for the next person to cross its path. I couldn't go back to that hospital, not ever. But what if someone else did? What if they didn't make it out like I did? The question haunted me in the days that followed. I never told anyone about what had happened in that hospital. Who would believe me? The place was already cursed in its own way, a hospital abandoned and forgotten by most. But I knew the truth. I knew that there was something dark, something terrifying that lingered there. I never went back to that hospital. I couldn't. The memory of that night haunted me in ways I couldn't explain. The strange sounds, the ghostly figures, the cold touch of death itself, it all remained etched in my mind, like a scar that refused to heal. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital had claimed something from me that night. Something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't get back. No matter how much I tried to move on, the echoes of that night lingered, like a shadow that would never fade. Some nights, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear the scratching of nails on metal, the whispers of forgotten souls trapped within the walls. And I know, deep down, that the hospital is still out there, still waiting, for me, for someone else. The question remains, what happened that night? What really took place within the walls of that abandoned hospital? The answers, if they exist, are buried deep within that dark, twisted place. And I have no intention of finding out. It's been years now since that night at the hospital, but it feels like it happened just yesterday. I still can't fully shake the fear that lingers deep within me, tucked away behind the daily routines of life. Time has passed, and I've done my best to move on, to forget what happened, and push the dark memories into the corners of my mind where they can't reach me. But every so often, I'll find myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I'll feel it, the pull of that place, the cold, oppressive feeling that wraps itself around me like a heavy blanket. I've tried to convince myself it was all just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the stress of a long shift, the isolation of being alone in an abandoned building. But deep down, I know what I felt, what I saw, and what I heard that night. That hospital was not just a place of death. It was a place where something darker, something far more sinister, waited in the shadows. I can't go back to that hospital. I want, and part of me feels guilty for even stepping foot in it in the first place, as if I somehow brought that darkness into my life by simply being there. But the more I reflect on it, the more I realize that I wasn't the first to feel its presence. The others who had worked there before me, the ones who disappeared without a trace, or those who quit in fear, they must have known something I didn't. Perhaps they were wise enough to leave long before I did. There's one thought that has haunted me since that night, one thought that I can't seem to escape. It's the realization that whatever haunted that place, whatever I encountered, is still out there, still lurking in the forgotten corners of the world. I don't know if it's tied to that specific hospital, or if it was just drawn there by the history of pain and suffering that surrounded it. But I can't shake the feeling that the hospital was just a doorway, a gateway to something far worse. In the years since, I've heard stories, heard whispers from others who've had similar experiences in abandoned places. Some people talk about the things they've seen, shadowy figures, cold spots, unexplainable noises that seem to follow them no matter where they go. I don't know if they're connected, if they're part of the same thing that haunted me, but I can't help but wonder. Maybe that's the hardest part, the not knowing, the unanswered questions that linger in the back of my mind. What was it? Was it a ghost, a spirit, or something darker? What was that chilling presence, and why was it drawn to me, to that hospital? I don't have answers, and am not sure I ever will. But I do know one thing. That hospital changed me. It left a mark on my soul, one that I can never fully erase. The fear never really goes away. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint sounds of movement in the distance, the scraping of something dragging across the floor. It's like the echoes of that night follow me wherever I go. And in the quietest moments, I sometimes wonder if I'm still being watched, if I'm still being hunted by whatever it was that I encountered. I've learned to live with it, to carry that weight with me. But I've also learned something else. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run or how much time has passed. The hospital may be gone, abandoned and forgotten by most, but it's not truly gone. The memories, the fear, and whatever was left behind still haunt that place. And maybe, just maybe, they've found their way into me. So now, when I hear people talk about the hospital, about its history, its dark reputation, I don't speak up. I don't share my story, my truth, because there are some things in this world that are better left untouched. Some questions that are better left unanswered. Maybe it's better that way. It was a summer I'll never forget, one that began like any other, with no sense of the creeping dread that would soon become a part of my life. My friends and I were the typical group, close-knit, always up for some adventure, no matter how small or out of the way. We spent most weekends hiking in the woods that surrounded our small town, enjoying the quiet escape from the daily grind. That forest, a patch of thick trees and overgrown paths, was something I had known my entire life. It was a place of simple beauty, a place where we could laugh, make memories, and not think twice about the world outside. Nothing ever seemed off about it. Until that summer. The forest was known to the locals as just a normal patch of wilderness, a few miles from the heart of town. Its edges had a few creeks, spots of thick bramble, and the occasional deer or other wildlife roaming between the trees. For those of us who lived nearby, it was just a part of life, part of the landscape we took for granted. We didn't think twice about its quiet shadows or the occasional rustle of leaves. I had always been the adventurous one, the one who would suggest the wildest ideas, and I often dragged my friends along. But unlike me, most of them weren't into the idea of exploring deeper into the forest. They liked the edge, the safe, familiar paths, and after a while, I stopped pushing them. But that summer, something shifted. One evening, when the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched across the path, I decided it was time to push the limits. I suggested we take a different trail, one that led deeper into the woods than we'd ever ventured before. The others hesitated. We had hiked those trails countless times, but the thought of straying further into the unknown made them uneasy. You know, it's just a little farther, I urged, trying to convince them. It's the perfect way to finish off the day. Besides, we've never gone this way before. After some back and forth, one of them, Henry, agreed, though he seemed less enthusiastic. But the others, Rob and Sophie, reluctantly followed, their faces betraying the uncertainty they didn't voice aloud. There was something in the air that evening, a thick humidity that made the trees feel closer, pressing in on us as we walked. The sounds of the usual forest critters seemed quieter somehow, like they were staying away, leaving us in our solitude. We trekked through the familiar woods, passing by the overgrown brush and the occasional fallen tree. It was almost eerie how much quieter it felt the deeper we went. Rob, who always had a knack for making jokes to break the tension, tried to lighten the mood. "What's the worst that could happen?" he laughed. "We find some lost treasure, or, I don't know, maybe a bear." But his laughter didn't carry far. The silence that had overtaken the forest seemed to swallow his words. As we walked, the trees began to grow taller, their branches intertwining above us like a natural canopy, blocking the fading light from the setting sun. It always enjoyed the feeling of being enveloped by nature, but tonight it was different. It felt heavier. Sophie, ever the skeptic, pointed out that it was getting darker faster than usual. "It's only around 6 o'clock, she remarked, checking her watch. "Why does it feel like it's already dusk?" We didn't have an answer for her, but I noticed the same thing. It wasn't just the dimming of light, it was the atmosphere itself, like the forest had decided to hold on to the day a little longer. The air had a dense weight to it, and the path seemed to wind endlessly, as if the forest was not just surrounding us, but consuming us, pulling us further into its depths. "We should probably turn back," Henry said, his voice barely audible. "It feels off." But I was stubborn. I dismissed his words, brushing it off as nothing more than nerves. I wasn't one to turn back easily, and besides, we hadn't even scratched the surface of the trail. As we moved forward, the sounds of the forest seemed to vanish entirely. No birds, no rustling in the leaves, nothing. It was as if the world had stopped around us. Rob's jokes had faded into silence, and Sophie's usual chatter had disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable sound of our footsteps crunching the dry earth beneath us. I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched, but I pushed the thought aside. After all, it was just a forest, right? What could possibly be wrong? But then I heard something. A low sound, almost like a grunt, but distant. At first, I chalked it up to the wind, but then it came again, closer this time. It wasn't any animal I knew, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Rob had heard it too. He looked around, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. Sophie, always the brave one, tried to stay calm. "It's probably just a deer or something." I wasn't so sure. The sound had been too unnatural, too deliberate. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. It felt as if the forest had become aware of us, aware that we were intruding on something it wasn't ready to share. We walked a few more steps, but it was clear to all of us that something had shifted. This was no longer the familiar place we had hiked countless times before. Something was off. And that was when the first real unsettling moment happened. The ground beneath us seemed to shift, and a branch cracked loudly somewhere behind us, though none of us had seen anyone or anything move. It was a stark, violent break in the unnatural silence. I turned to look, but there was nothing, just shadows and trees. Henry, his voice barely a whisper, spoke again. "We should go back." But this time, no one argued. It was clear that the forest, once a place of comfort, had turned into something else entirely, and whatever had been watching us, whatever had been following us, was not going to let us go that easily. The hike back was supposed to be easy, a quick retracing of our steps. But as we turned around to head in the opposite direction, the forest felt different. The oppressive silence hung thick in the air, far heavier than it had been just minutes before. It was like the very trees themselves were waiting, watching, as we made our way back along the path. No birds, no rustling leaves, no sound of distant animals. Just us, and the overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone. Henry kept glancing over his shoulder, his steps growing quicker with every second, though he tried to maintain some semblance of calm. "It's just a forest," he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "It's just a forest." Nothing strange about it, but his voice wavered, betraying his unease. Sophie, usually the bold one, walked just a little too close to me, her shoulders tense, eyes scanning the shadows. That noise, she said quietly, almost as if she didn't want to hear her own voice. Did anyone else hear that? Before? Just now? I nodded slowly. Yeah, I heard it too, but I don't know what it was. I wanted to say more, wanted to brush it off like I always did with strange noises in the woods, but there was something in the air tonight that kept me from speaking. My own instincts were starting to whisper warnings, things I couldn't quite explain, things I wasn't sure I even wanted to explain. But we were too deep in now. I couldn't turn back. Not with everyone here. Not with the quiet pressing on all sides, pushing us further down this unfamiliar path. Rob, who had been walking behind us, suddenly stopped. I could see his silhouette through the thickening gloom of the forest as he bent down to examine something on the ground. His flashlight, which we had switched on earlier to cut through the growing dark, shone briefly across a patch of soil. "What's this?" he muttered, his voice sounding almost curious, though there was an edge of something else there, something uneasy. We all stopped and turned. Rob knelt down, poking at something that didn't quite seem right. I could barely make out the shape through the flickering light, but I could see enough to know it wasn't natural. A trail of strange, dark imprints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were just animal tracks, larger than usual, perhaps, but nothing too unusual. Rob squatted down further, running his fingers lightly over the marks. The ground was soft, like it had been disturbed recently. But the tracks, there was something wrong about them. The shape of them wasn't quite right. It wasn't the uniform, rounded shape of an animal's paws. It was irregular, almost human-like in some places, but with deep, jagged edges that didn't belong in the forest. "I don't like this," Henry said again, his voice tight. His eyes darted nervously toward the woods, and he couldn't seem to stay still, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Let's just go. Now." But Rob wasn't ready to let it go. He was the one of us who had always been the most daring, the most willing to push things further, even if it meant getting a little uncomfortable in the process. "Maybe we should follow it," he suggested. "It could lead us to something. Or someone. It could be a clue." "A clue to what?" Sophie asked, her voice laced with skepticism. But even she was leaning in, staring at the tracks, unwilling to look away. "What's the point? It's just..." But her words were cut off as Rob stood up suddenly, his flashlight darting across the path ahead of us. There was something else. Something I couldn't explain. The trees ahead of us looked wrong. The way the branches twisted and turned, as though they were curling in on themselves. The darkness between them seemed deeper, like it had a presence, something lurking in it. I felt my breath catch. "Rob, stop," I said, my voice coming out more forcefully than I intended. "Let's just go. It's not worth it." Rob turned to look at me, his face illuminated by the beam of the flashlight. His expression was strange, too serious for a joke, too tense for reassurance. "It's just a little farther. We're close. I can feel it." Before anyone could stop him, he took a step forward, following the strange trail deeper into the trees. His light bobbed in front of him, casting long, eerie shadows against the trunks of the trees. Sophie let out an exasperated sigh. "Rob, stop being stupid. We need to leave." "It's getting late." But there was no stopping him. Rob continued to move, urging us to follow. Slowly, hesitantly, we began to fall into line behind him. My heart was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Maybe it was the curiosity. Maybe it was the way Rob seemed so determined. Or maybe it was something else, something that had begun to gnaw at the edges of my mind, something I couldn't place, but I couldn't ignore. The deeper we went, the more I felt that growing pressure, that sensation of being trapped, of the forest closing in on us. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves overpowering. My skin prickled. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to tell myself it was just nerves, but the silence in the air wasn't normal. It wasn't the peaceful silence you expect in a forest. It was oppressive. A silence that felt like it was being forced on us. A silence that screamed for us to leave. We walked in a single line now, the path narrowing the further we went. Rob led the way, his flashlight cutting through the dark like a beacon, but even his light couldn't seem to push back the shadows. They clung to the edges of the trail, stretching and shifting as if they were alive. Then we heard it again. The noise. Not an animal this time. No, this sound was much different. A low, dragging sound, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. We all stopped in our tracks. Rob's flashlight froze, the beam jittering as he swung it frantically around the forest, trying to catch whatever was out there. But there was nothing. No movement. No creatures. Just the sound of something. Dragging. The light bounced again, but when it landed on the path ahead, the air seemed to change. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, as if the trees had drawn closer together in the time we had been walking, suffocating the space around us. Sophie, her face pale, whispered, "We need to go. Now." But before any of us could move, we heard the sound again, closer this time, and it was unmistakable. Whatever it was behind us now, trailing us, following us with deliberate, slow steps. I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing there. We stood frozen for a moment, caught between our instincts and the creeping dread that held us in place. Then, in an instant, Rob made a decision. Without a word, he turned and started running. Sophie, Henry, and I followed suit, fear propelling us forward as we tore down the narrow trail, back toward the main path, not daring to look behind. We reached the clearing just as the last of the daylight faded, the trees around us dark and suffocating. We were back on the main trail, but even as we slowed, gasping for air, the presence didn't leave. The feeling that something was watching us didn't go away. And that dragging sound, the sound of something following us, seemed to stop. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We had no idea what was out there in the forest or what had been trailing us. And now, there was no turning back. The night had fallen completely by the time we found ourselves standing in the clearing, our breath still ragged, our legs sore from running. The trees loomed around us like silent sentinels, their branches stretching into the sky, twisted and skeletal in the fading moonlight. There was no sound, no movement, except for the heavy silence that hung over the forest, thick and suffocating. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the air still, as if the forest was holding its breath. We stood there for a long time, our eyes darting nervously between one another, unwilling to break the silence. No one spoke at first. There was no need to. We all knew that something was wrong. Something was out there. Something we couldn't see but could feel, pressing in on us from all sides. I looked around, trying to make sense of the dark shapes that surrounded us. The trees were taller here, their trunks thicker, their bark rough and gnarled like ancient hands reaching up toward the sky. The ground beneath our feet felt uneven, as though the earth itself was shifting, as though it had grown tired of holding up the weight of the world. My shoes sank into the soft soil, and I could almost hear the mud squelch beneath me, as though it were alive. Henry was the first to speak, his voice low and cautious. We should have never gone this deep. Sophie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally broke the silence, her voice shaky. What was that thing? The breathing. I heard it. It was right behind us. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The memory of that dragging sound, followed by the heavy, labored breaths, still hung in the air, as though it was following us, waiting for the moment when we would slip up. There was no denying it now. Whatever was out there was real, and it was hunting us. Rob had been silent too, his face pale under the dim light of the moon. He was the one who had led us down this path, but now his confidence had vanished. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said finally, his voice tight. "We can't just keep running forever. There's something here, and we need to know what it is." I nodded, but I didn't feel the same certainty in his words. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to leave, to get back to the safety of the town, where the darkness didn't press in on you like it did here. But there was no turning back now. We had crossed the line, and there was no escaping the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Henry's eyes scanned the trees, his gaze sharp, as though he were looking for something, anything, that could explain the strange events of the evening. "Let's go back to the path," he suggested. "Maybe we can find some sign of what's been following us." We hesitated for a moment, but finally, we nodded in agreement. Rob took the lead, his flashlight sweeping across the ground as we retraced our steps, moving cautiously along the edge of the clearing. The trees seemed to close in around us, casting long, dark shadows that shifted and twisted like living things. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. There was something in the air tonight, something palpable, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I thought I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the edge of the light, a shadow flickering in the trees. But when I turned my head to look, there was nothing there. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing down on us, suffocating us. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, their trunks wider, their branches twisted and knotted like the limbs of some monstrous creature. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping by the minute. The chill crept into my bones, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, though it didn't help. The wind had picked up, but it was a strange kind of wind, like the breath of something ancient and forgotten, whispering through the trees. And then, just as I thought I could take no more of the oppressive silence, we heard it again. The noise! At first, it was faint, barely audible, but it was there. That dragging sound, closer this time, and louder, as though whatever it was had been following us all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my eyes darting around, trying to find the source of the noise. It was so close now, so close that I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. Rob was the first to react, his flashlight beam trembling as he swung it around, his eyes wide with panic. "There. Do you see it?" We all turned, our hearts pounding in our chests, our breath coming in short gasps. But there was nothing, just the trees, standing motionless, the shadows stretching out before us like a dark sea. "It's not real," Henry muttered under his breath, though I could hear the tremor in his voice. "We're just imagining things." But I didn't believe him. I knew what I had heard. I knew what we had all heard. And I knew that whatever it wasn't going to let us leave. We moved forward again, our steps quickening as we tried to outrun the sound, but it followed us, closer this time, as if it were attached to us. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift with every step, the earth groaning and shifting as if something deep below was waking up. Every tree, every rock, every root felt like it was part of something bigger, something older, something more powerful than anything we could understand. Then, without warning, Rob stopped. He held up a hand, signaling for us to be quiet. The flashlight beam froze on a tree ahead of us, its bark slick and dark, like it had been soaked in something. My eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of the strange markings that seemed to crawl up the trunk. Symbols, perhaps? Or scratches? I couldn't tell. "What is that?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Rob stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he shined it directly onto the markings. "It looks like someone or something scratched the bark, like it was trying to claw its way up the tree." I stepped closer, my curiosity getting the better of me, despite the fear gnawing at the back of my mind. The marks were deep, too deep for a simple animal. They looked almost deliberate, as if someone had carved them with purpose, with intent. Henry stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This wasn't here before," he said, his voice tight. "This wasn't here when we passed earlier." We all turned, our gazes flicking nervously back and forth between the tree and the darkened forest. The air had grown heavier again, thick with something I couldn't name. but something that pressed on my chest made it hard to breathe. And then, just as I thought I was going to lose my mind from the silence and the weight of the forest around us, we heard it again. The breathing. It was no longer distant, no longer faint. It was right behind us, coming from the shadows, dragging and labored, the sound of something or someone shuffling closer. Panic surged through me like a wave, and I turned, my legs moving before my brain could catch up. "Run!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted into the dark forest, the sounds of the dragging, heavy breaths behind us. The trees blurred around us as we raced through the underbrush, crashing through the tangled vines and roots, unable to stop ourselves. I glanced over my shoulder, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the dim light, I saw it, a shape, tall and dark, standing just beyond the reach of our flashlights. And it wasn't going to let us escape. The forest, dark and suffocating, seemed to close in on us as we ran, each step heavier than the last, each breath more labored. I could hear the others behind me, their frantic footsteps pounding against the ground. But there was something else, something deeper, more unsettling. A sound that came from somewhere just beyond the trees, like the earth itself was groaning in agony, or perhaps something much more alive than we could ever imagine. I dared not look back again, but the terrifying reality of what we were facing hit me like a physical blow. The shape, the figure, it had been following us, always just behind, just out of reach of the light. But now, in the thickening dark, it was no longer content to hide in the shadows. It had come into the open, and it was waiting for us to make a mistake. Our frantic sprint through the trees was slowing, each of us growing more exhausted, more disoriented. I had lost track of time. It felt like hours, though I knew it couldn't have been. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the realization that we were no closer to finding a way out only deepened the panic. Then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath my feet gave way. It wasn't much, just a slight shift in the earth, but it was enough to send me crashing forward. My hands hit the ground first, scraping against the rough terrain as I tried to catch myself, but the next thing I knew, I was falling. The ground beneath me wasn't solid. It was soft, yielding, almost like I was sinking into it. I screamed as I tumbled into a pit, my body twisting painfully as I landed hard against the damp, cold floor. The others shouted my name, but I couldn't answer. My breath was knocked from me, my body completely disoriented as I tried to scramble to my feet. The world was spinning, the edges of my vision blurred, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling, and as I did, I realized that I wasn't alone. The pit wasn't empty. I froze, my eyes wide, scanning the dim light, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The air felt different here, heavier, thick with a strange kind of energy that sent chills racing down my spine. The walls of the pit were covered in dark, damp earth, with roots and vines twisting around them like something out of a nightmare. But that wasn't the worst part. It was the eyes. They glowed faintly in the dark, scattered across the walls of the pit like tiny orbs of light. There were dozens of them, no, hundreds. As I stared, frozen in terror, they blinked in unison, watching me, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I had never felt more alone, more vulnerable than I did in that moment. From behind me, I could hear the others calling out to me, but their voices seemed distant, muffled, as if they were being swallowed by the earth itself. Panic surged through me again, and I reached out a trembling hand to grab the nearest vine to pull myself up. But the vine didn't budge. It was slick and cold, pulsing slightly as if it were alive. My fingers slipped from it, and I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I tried to regain some composure. Then, a noise cut through the air, sharp and guttural, like something large dragging itself across the ground. I turned, my heart stopping in my chest as I saw it. The figure was no longer a shadow. It was fully revealed now, standing just on the edge of the pit. The shape of it was tall and thin, too thin, its limbs long and stretched, unnaturally so. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a sickly gray, taut across a skeletal frame. The face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out the outline of something. No, someone, almost human, yet distorted, twisted in a way that felt wrong. Its eyes, large and black, locked onto mine, and I couldn't look away. They weren't just watching me, they were pulling me in, drawing me toward them. I heard Henry's voice then, frantic, as he reached the edge of the pit. "Get out of there," he shouted, but his voice seemed distant, as if it were coming from another world entirely. He was right there, but the air between us felt thick, as though it were separating us, pulling us apart. I reached out to him, desperate, but my arm was heavy, like it was being weighed down by something far more powerful than I could comprehend. I could see the panic in Henry's eyes, in Sophie's and Rob's, but none of them could help me. The figure in the pit was the only thing that mattered now, and it was coming closer. The air shifted again, and I felt a sudden pressure on my chest. It was as though the air itself had turned to lead, crushing me under its weight. The eyes blinked again, and I felt it, its presence closing in on me, the heavy, suffocating energy that surrounded it like an invisible storm. It reached out, not with its hands, but with something else, something far darker. I screamed as I felt a coldness press against my skin, freezing me from the inside out. The figure reached into the pit, its hand, or what looked like a hand, stretching toward me. Its fingers were long, too long, and as it touched me, I felt the warmth drain from my body, replaced by a coldness so deep, so unnatural, that it felt like my very soul was being pulled away. Suddenly, the air snapped back into place, and I was free from its grasp, free from its touch. I gasped, my breath ragged and shallow, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I turned, stumbling toward the edge of the pit, reaching up for Henry's outstretched hand. He pulled me up, his grip tight as he helped me back to solid ground, and I collapsed against him, unable to speak, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Sophie and Rob were at the edge now, pulling me further away from the pit, their faces filled with fear, but also something else, something I couldn't name. But as we moved away, the figure remained in the pit, watching us, its dark eyes never leaving us for a second. And I knew then, with every fiber of my being, that we had not escaped. It had only let us go for now. We turned, moving quickly, our feet slipping on the slick earth as we made our way through the trees. The heavy silence pressed in on us, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the quiet of the forest. It was the quiet of something watching us, following us, waiting for the moment when it would strike again. And it would. I was sure of it, because we were not safe. Not yet. The forest had swallowed everything. Every sound, every memory, every trace of what we had experienced there seemed to fade into the oppressive silence of the night. But I could feel it still, deep in my bones, the unmistakable weight of being hunted. The trees around us loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches stretching out like skeletal hands, ready to grab us at any moment. We kept moving, all of us silent, the sound of our feet scraping against the dirt and leaves the only noise breaking the stillness. Henry, Sophie, and Rob were ahead of me, their faces pale in the faint moonlight. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear I felt clawing at my insides. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. There were no words left for what we had seen. The further we moved from the pit, the more the tension began to ease, but only slightly. The oppressive weight of whatever it was that had followed us still lingered. There was no safety in the air. There was no relief from the terror that had taken root in our minds. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, standing in the pit, its dark eyes locked onto mine. I could still feel the chill it had sent through my body. I could still hear the way it had moved, its unnatural grace, its horrifying presence. As we walked, our steps became more frantic, more urgent. We had no plan, no destination in mind, just the desperate need to escape, to get out of that forest, to put as much distance between us and whatever had been watching us. But even as we moved, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sophie was the first to break the silence. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's gone?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously to the trees around us. Rob, always the more practical one, shook his head. "It's not gone. Whatever it is, it's still out there, watching us, waiting." His voice trembled with a fear that he couldn't hide, no matter how hard he tried. Henry, who had been unusually quiet, stopped walking for a moment. He turned to face us, his eyes haunted. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay in this place. It's not safe." I nodded, my stomach twisting with a deep, gnawing fear. We all knew what had to be done. We had to leave. But the question was, could we ever truly leave? Could we escape the nightmare that had latched onto us, that had followed us back from the depths of that cursed forest? The answer, I feared, was no. We moved faster now, not bothering to look back, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to outrun the terror that had taken root in our minds. The path ahead seemed endless, the trees closing in on us, but every so often I would glance up and catch a glimpse of the sky through the canopy, dark, oppressive, but free. For a moment, it felt like we might make it. We might find our way back to normal. But then the noise came. A crack, a snap, a twig breaking, the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush behind us. We froze. Our breath caught in our throats as we turned slowly, our eyes searching the darkness. Nothing. Just the trees, the shadows. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel it again, the presence. It was watching us. It was still out there. "Keep moving," Henry whispered, his voice hoarse. "We can't stop. We can't let it catch us." We didn't need to be told twice. We pushed forward, hearts pounding in our chests, the weight of our fear pressing down on us with every step. The path seemed to twist and bend in ways it hadn't before, as if the forest itself were conspiring against us. The trees seemed closer, more threatening, the shadows deeper, darker. The very air felt suffocating, thick with something we couldn't name. Every time I turned my head, I half expected to see it there, just beyond the trees, watching us. But nothing ever came. Still, we ran. We ran for what felt like hours, never stopping, never looking back. Eventually, we reached the edge of the forest. The trees opened up, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we saw the soft glow of streetlights in the distance. The small town was just ahead, its familiar buildings barely visible through the trees. We had made it. But something was wrong. Something felt off. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We didn't speak. We just walked, our pace quickening as we neared the town. I could hear the sound of my heart thundering in my chest, each step a desperate attempt to outrun the terror that followed us. I glanced at the others, Henry, Sophie, Rob, but their faces were as pale as mine, their eyes wide with fear. We had made it out of the forest, but we hadn't escaped. As we reached the edge of the town, something caught my eye. A shape standing just inside the tree line, watching us. I stopped in my tracks. "What is it?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The figure in the shadows was all too familiar. The shape, the long, twisted limbs. The face that wasn't quite human, but not entirely inhuman either. It was there, just out of reach, watching us with those black, soulless eyes. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my body frozen in place. Henry and Rob had already seen it. They were backing away, their eyes wide with terror, but Sophie was still staring at the figure, her body trembling. "It's still following us," Rob said, his voice breaking. "We can't outrun it. We can't leave." I wanted to tell them that we could. I wanted to believe that we had made it. But I knew better now. Whatever we had encountered in that forest wasn't bound by the rules of the world we knew. It didn't care about boundaries. It didn't care about distance. It was here, and it wasn't leaving. We turned and ran, the figure still watching us from the shadows, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing down on us as we fled. We didn't look back. We couldn't. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the town. But even then, I knew something had changed. Something had shifted within us. No matter how far we ran, no matter how much we tried to put it behind us, it was always there. Just out of reach, just in the corner of our eyes. Not ever. We never spoke of it again, not in detail. We tried to move on with our lives as if that night had been nothing more than a bad dream. The town was small, and in the weeks that followed, I could see the weight of the experience settle over us like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. We continued our lives, work, school, relationships, but something had irrevocably shifted. We had seen something that changed us all in ways we couldn't understand. But talking about it felt wrong, like it might pull us back into the abyss we'd escaped. The thing is, I don't know if we really escaped. There are moments, even now, when I still feel its presence. The trees are just trees, and the moonlight is just moonlight. But there's something in the air, something in the way the world feels a little too quiet at night, a little too still. Sometimes, when I'm walking alone through the town, I hear it, that faint crack of a twig, the rustle of something moving in the distance. And for a split second, I think, maybe, just maybe, it's out there again. Watching. Waiting. I still have the dreams. They're always the same. I'm back in the forest, the shadows growing long around me, and I can hear it, feel it, closer, closer, closer until I wake up in a cold sweat. Sometimes I swear I can still hear its footsteps behind me, like the echo of something I can never outrun. As for Henry, Sophie, and Rob, we drifted apart, each of us trying to forget. They found their own ways of coping, but I think, deep down, we all knew that night wasn't something that could just be erased. The forest had done something to us, had planted a seed of doubt and fear that would grow, twisting itself into the very core of our beings. It was always there, like an unspoken agreement between us. We never asked, and we never shared, but we all knew the forest wasn't done with us. I saw Sophie a few months ago. We ran into each other by chance at a coffee shop. Her eyes were tired, darker than they had been before, and when she saw me, she gave me a small, knowing smile. We didn't talk about the forest. We didn't need to. We just sat there, sipping our coffee, avoiding the silence that could unravel us all. But when I left, I noticed something odd. The moment I stepped outside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around, half expecting to see the shape standing in the shadows of the alley. My heart raced in my chest. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the memory, just the echo of what we had lived through, but the feeling lingered. I think that's the scariest part of all, knowing that it's never really gone. No matter how far you run, no matter how far you try to push it out of your mind, it's still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to remind you of what you've seen, what you felt. I used to tell myself that what happened in that forest could be explained, that there was some logical reason for the strange events, the things we saw. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us, or maybe it was the sheer isolation of being out there, the exhaustion and fear taking hold of our senses. But as the years pass, that explanation feels less and less believable. There are things in this world that can't be explained. Things that defy logic and reason, things that are beyond the understanding of the human mind. And what we encountered in that forest, it wasn't a trick. It wasn't a figment of our imagination. It was real. The last time I spoke to Rob, he was different. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always about the same thing, the nightmares. The way the forest seemed to call to him, pulling him back. He said he'd been to therapy, tried everything he could to forget, but it was always there, in the back of his mind. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would wake up, his heart pounding, convinced that it had come for him again. He'd always hear that same crack of a twig, that same rustling noise in the distance. I haven't heard from Henry in a while. I don't think I will. He left town a few months after our encounter in the forest, packed up and moved without a word. He left everything behind, his job, his friends, his apartment. I don't think he ever told anyone why. I never asked. There are some things that don't need to be said, things that you just know, deep in your gut. But for me, the memories of that night are always close. I'll be walking down the street or lying in bed, and it will hit me, the sensation that something is watching me. It's as if the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. Sometimes, it feels like I'm not alone, even when I'm in a crowd of people, as if something is standing just behind me, waiting for the perfect moment. I don't know if the forest is still out there, or if it's just in my mind now, a lingering trace of fear that refuses to let go. But I do know one thing for sure. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy all logic and reason. And once you've seen them, once you've felt them, they stay with you forever. So I keep going. I keep living my life, because what else can I do? But deep down, I know the truth. It's never over. The forest will always be there, just beyond the edge of the world, waiting for the next time it calls. And when it does, I don't know if it'll be ready. But I know one thing. I won't be the same person when it happens. It all started last year, when I, along with a few close friends, decided to take a road trip to a small town in the mountains. We were looking for a peaceful weekend getaway, far from the noise and distractions of city life. A place where we could unwind, enjoy nature, and get a good night's sleep in the quiet. Little did we know, our choice of accommodations would turn this peaceful retreat into a nightmare. The town we were heading to was a charming place, known for its scenic views and old-world architecture. Its history stretched back to the 1800s, with buildings that had stood the test of time. Among these old structures was a hotel that had been around for decades, an imposing, ivy-covered building at the edge of town. It looked like something from another era, its tall windows glistening under the setting sun, and its doorways framed by weathered stone. When we arrived at the hotel, we were greeted by the manager, a middle-aged man with a kind smile and a voice that was too smooth to be anything but practiced. He told us the hotel had just recently reopened after undergoing some renovations. The place had a certain charm, despite its age, and he reassured us that the hotel was now better than ever. There were 4 of us on this trip, 2 couples, each in their late 20s. We were all looking forward to a few days of peace and quiet. We had all known each other since college and shared a bond that was hard to break. We had been through a lot together over the years, and this trip was supposed to be an escape. I, personally, was excited to relax and recharge before life got busy again. That night, after we settled into our rooms, we decided to meet in the lobby for some coffee. The hotel had a cozy, vintage feel, with leather armchairs and wooden tables scattered around. It was the perfect setting to catch up and talk about life. As we gathered around a table near the fireplace, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept glancing around, looking for something, though I couldn't quite place it. The fire crackled softly in the background, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. We all laughed and talked, but there was an underlying unease that none of us could ignore. The conversations felt forced, as though we were all just trying to fill the silence. At times, it felt like the hotel itself was listening, watching, waiting. The staff at the hotel seemed friendly enough, but they had an odd way about them. The manager, who we had met earlier, would occasionally pop into the lobby, smiling warmly and offering little tidbits of information about the hotel's history. However, whenever we asked more specific questions, he seemed to become a little too vague. It was almost as if he didn't want us to know too much about the place. The other staff members, the ones working the night shift, were just as distant and formal. It wasn't anything overt, but there was an unsettling vibe to the whole place. Despite the strange atmosphere, we tried our best to make the most of our time there. We spent the next few hours wandering around the hotel, exploring its old corridors and admiring the antique furniture and decor. There was something fascinating about the place, something that drew us in despite the unease we all felt. The history was rich, and you could almost hear the echoes of the past in the creaking floors and the distant hum of the heating system. As the night wore on, we all headed back to our respective rooms to get some rest. I, for one, was looking forward to a good night's sleep. After a long drive, I was exhausted. But as I lay down in my bed, the unease I had felt earlier returned, settling over me like a thick fog. I pulled the covers up to my chin and tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. The hotel was old, and old buildings had their quirks. Nothing more to it. But as I lay there, the silence of the hotel seemed to press in on me. It wasn't a comforting silence, but an oppressive one. It felt as though the walls were closing in, and I found myself staring at the dark ceiling, unable to sleep. The room felt too still, too quiet. I thought I heard a faint creak of floorboards from the hallway outside, but when I got up to check, the hallway was empty. No one was around, and the silence returned. I tried to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I had been in plenty of old hotels before, and they all had their odd sounds, creaky floors, settling beams, wind whistling through cracks in the walls. But this felt different. There was something off about it, something I couldn't explain. The next morning, when we gathered for breakfast, I mentioned the strange feeling I had the night before. To my surprise, the others had experienced similar sensations. One of my friends had heard footsteps in the hallway outside his room, though no one had been there. Another friend said she had felt a cold breeze sweep through her room, even though the windows were all tightly shut. We tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to the old building's quirks. But deep down, we all knew something was wrong. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that there was something in the hotel that didn't want us there. But we were determined to enjoy the rest of our trip. We spent the day hiking and exploring the surrounding area, trying to forget the eerie atmosphere of the hotel. When we returned in the evening, we were tired but content, ready to relax for the night. However, as we settled back into the hotel, we couldn't help but notice that the strange feeling was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. It was as if the hotel was waiting for something, or someone. Little did we know, this was just the beginning of our encounter with the haunted hotel. What we had experienced so far was nothing compared to what was to come. The next day started like any other. We woke up early to a bright morning, eager to explore more of the town and its surroundings. The crisp mountain air was refreshing, and as we stepped outside, the sun beamed down on us, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. Everything seemed perfect, But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. We spent most of the day walking around the town, taking in the sights, chatting with locals, and trying to push the odd sensations of the hotel to the back of our minds. By the time we returned in the late afternoon, we were all exhausted. We agreed to meet in the lobby for a quick rest before dinner, but I decided to take a short nap in my room before joining the others. I closed the door behind me and collapsed onto the bed, the sheets cool against my skin. The room was still and quiet, with only the occasional sound of a distant bird or rustling leaves outside. I lay there, eyes closed, trying to fall asleep, but the same feeling from the night before returned. It was a subtle sense of unease, like a shadow in the corner of my mind that I couldn't ignore. I tried to dismiss it. It had been a long day, and I was just tired. But the silence in the room felt different now. It felt more unnatural. I could hear the faintest hum of the air conditioning, the soft rustling of the curtains, and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Yet, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. I sat up immediately, startled. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't heard anyone walking down the hall. In fact, the hotel had been so quiet that I hadn't heard a single footstep outside my room all day. I glanced at the door, my pulse quickening. It had sounded like a gentle tap, almost as if someone was testing to see if I was awake. But there was no way anyone could have gotten so close without me hearing their footsteps. Hesitant, I stood up, slowly making my way toward the door. I opened it cautiously, half expecting someone to be standing there with a cheerful smile. But to my surprise, the hallway was completely empty. No one was there. I stepped into the hallway, scanning it up and down, but there was no sign of anyone. The silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. My mind raced as I stood there, unsure of what to do. The knock had been real, there was no doubt about that. But who could have been at my door? I stood in the hallway for a few more moments, debating whether I should check with the front desk or just forget about it. But just as I turned to go back into my room, I heard something else, faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone earlier, and now there was someone walking just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel my breath quicken. I wasn't sure what to do. The instinct to retreat into my room was overpowering, but curiosity had me rooted to the spot. I turned toward the sound, straining to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was coming closer. The footsteps seemed to be moving at a steady pace, but no one appeared. The hall remained empty. The eerie sound of those footsteps seemed to stretch on forever, but the source of them was nowhere to be found. Finally, I decided it had enough. My mind was racing, my heart still hammering in my chest. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my hands trembling slightly as I leaned against it. I stood there for a long time, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. It had only been a few knocks, a few footsteps, but the fear that gripped me felt real, and it was impossible to ignore. After several moments, I managed to calm myself enough to venture downstairs. When I walked into the lobby, the others were already there, sitting around the coffee table. The moment I entered, they all looked up, their expressions varying from tired to curious. "Everything okay?" one of them asked. "Yeah, just odd," I said, forcing a smile. I wasn't ready to share the strange encounter with them yet. I wasn't sure what to make of it myself. I heard a knock at the door, but when I opened it, no one was there. Then, there were footsteps in the hall. They all exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't like any of us to spook easily, but we'd all felt the strange atmosphere in the hotel. Still, we tried to brush it off as just a coincidence. "It's probably nothing," one of my friends said. "Old buildings creak, and it's probably just the wind." But even as the words left her mouth, I could tell she didn't believe it herself. There was an unease in her eyes that mirrored my own. We tried to focus on the conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, even in the warmth of the lobby. The air felt thick again, as though something was hanging just out of sight, waiting. Later that evening, when we sat down for dinner in the hotel's dining area, we couldn't shake the weirdness of the day. Wed tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the room was palpable. We ate in silence for the most part, occasionally exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The hotel seemed to have a strange power over us, a quiet, oppressive force that lingered even when no one was saying anything. As we finished our meal and got ready to head back to our rooms, something happened that only deepened the sense of discomfort. As we walked back through the lobby, I caught a glimpse of the manager standing by the front desk. His usual friendly smile was gone. His face was expressionless, almost as if he was waiting for something or someone. For a brief moment, our eyes locked, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I quickly looked away, feeling the weight of his gaze on the back of my neck. It wasn't much, but in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The manager's sudden change in demeanor had unsettled me. Was he hiding something? Or was I just letting my nerves get the best of me? As the night wore on, things only became stranger. We all returned to our rooms, and I lay in bed once more, trying to ignore the creeping fear that had taken hold of me. I had heard the knock, heard the footsteps, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was alive in a way I couldn't explain. Sleep was difficult to come by that night. Every creak, every shift in the air seemed magnified. I lay in the darkness, wide awake, listening to the silence that pressed in around me. It felt like the walls were closing in, and I knew I wasn't alone. Something was there, just beyond my vision, watching, waiting. The next morning, when we gathered for breakfast, no one mentioned the previous night's events. But I could see it in their eyes. They had all felt it too. The hotel's strange grip on us was tightening, and none of us could ignore it any longer. The knock, the footsteps, the manager's strange behavior, it was all adding up to something bigger than we could understand. And we hadn't even scratched the surface of what was to come. The following days only added layers to the mounting tension that was hanging over the hotel. What started as one strange occurrence quickly spiraled into a pattern of unsettling events. Each one was more intense than the last, and the strange presence that seemed to haunt the hotel grew stronger. There were no more knocks, no more footsteps. Instead, the hotel seemed to hum with an invisible energy that made everything feel out of place. It wasn't just in the halls or the rooms anymore. The strange occurrences were happening everywhere, outside, inside, at all hours of the day and night. The feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. I'd step outside for a breath of fresh air, only to feel an oppressive weight in the atmosphere. It was like the very air was thick with something unspoken. But it wasn't until the second night that things began to escalate. That night, I couldn't sleep. The clock ticked in the corner of the room, its sound louder than it should have been in the oppressive quiet. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows with a low, eerie sound. I could hear the branches of the trees scraping against the walls, a sound that sent chills down my spine. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of something or someone scraping along the floor. I sat up in bed, heart racing. The noise came from the hallway again, just outside my door. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the floor, as though someone was dragging something heavy behind them. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't the sound of a person walking. It was more like a heavy, unnatural shuffle, the kind of noise that would only be made if something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I listened intently, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The dragging sound continued, getting closer to my door. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Could it have been a person? But why didn't they knock? Why was it so strange, so wrong? The sound stopped right outside my door. A cold sweat broke out across my back as I lay there, frozen. I dared not move, my eyes glued to the crack beneath the door, waiting for any sign of movement. It was as if the entire hotel had gone still, waiting. Then, with a suddenness that made my blood run cold, the door handle rattled. Not just once, but several times in rapid succession, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. I held my breath, feeling like I was going to suffocate from the tension. Just as quickly as it started, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed there in the darkness, too afraid to move, too afraid to make a sound. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours, but eventually I managed to gather the strength to move. Slowly, I pushed myself off the bed, my legs unsteady beneath me. I crept toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Something told me that whatever was on the other side wasn't something I wanted to face. I backed away from the door, my heart still racing, and I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes wide open, waiting for the next sound. But it never came. The next morning, I gathered my friends in the lobby and told them everything that had happened. They listened intently, their faces a mix of concern and skepticism. I could tell they didn't want to believe me, but I also knew they could sense it too. The strange pull of the hotel, the oppressive weight that seemed to hang in the air. It was impossible to ignore. "We need to find out what's going on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just keep pretending everything is normal." They agreed, reluctantly at first, but their concern was evident. We couldn't just sit back and wait for whatever was happening to us to escalate further. We had to investigate. Later that day, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, we decided to start exploring the hotel, trying to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. The manager had been oddly distant, and none of the staff seemed willing to talk. They were polite enough, but there was an air of unease that clung to them, as though they were hiding something. The lobby was eerily quiet as we made our way toward the back of the hotel, toward the areas that we hadn't explored yet. The hallway seemed longer now, as though the walls were closing in, and the air grew heavier with every step we took. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the silence, but even that felt unnatural, like the very building was amplifying the sounds of our presence. As we reached the end of the hall, we came to a small door that appeared to lead to a storage area. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered from within. We hesitated, unsure of what we might find, but curiosity got the better of us. We stepped inside. The room was filled with old furniture and dusty boxes, some of them stacked high in the corners. There was an unmistakable smell in the air, musty, damp, and a little bit sour. But what caught our attention wasn't the furniture or the smell. It was the wall. On the far side of the room, hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a door. It was small and unmarked, almost as though it had been forgotten over time. The wood was aged, and the frame was cracked. The door seemed out of place in the otherwise ordinary storage room. Without speaking, we all knew what we had to do. We approached the door together, our movements cautious. I reached out to touch the doorknob, but as soon as my hand made contact, I felt it a jolt of cold that sent a shiver through my spine, as though the door was alive, resisting my touch. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside was another hallway, narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under our weight. The hallway stretched on for what seemed like miles, disappearing into darkness. We took a few steps inside, the air growing colder with each movement. It was as though the temperature dropped with our every step until I could see my breath in the air. And that's when it happened. A faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, floated through the air. It was a voice, low and distorted, as though coming from the very walls themselves. "Leave!" We froze, the words echoing in our minds, vibrating in the very air we breathed. The fear that had been creeping in the back of my mind now exploded, and we all turned to run. But as we fled, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. I could feel something behind me, something watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. We didn't look back as we rushed through the hotel, the whispers growing louder with every step. The building seemed to shift around us, its walls closing in. The temperature continued to plummet, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for us. We burst into the lobby, out of breath, hearts racing. The door behind us slammed shut, and for a brief moment, everything went still. But the sense of dread hadn't left. The feeling of being watched was stronger now than ever before. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was watching us. We had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. We were no longer just investigating the hotel. We were running out of options, running out of time, and running from something far beyond our understanding. The oppressive air that had once been a mere discomfort had now become a presence, something we couldn't avoid, something that was deliberately closing in on us. It was suffocating, and every corner we turned seemed to only tighten the grip. As we made our way back to our rooms, trying to process what we had just seen and heard, the atmosphere grew even more charged. The flickering lights were no longer random. They were deliberate, synchronized with our every movement, as if the hotel itself was responding to us, to our fear. The walls creaked with what could only be described as a sickening groan. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, unstable, almost as though the entire building was a living organism, one that we had disturbed. I tried to speak, to reason with my friends, but every word that left my mouth seemed to feel insignificant in the face of what we were facing. The sounds from the walls were growing louder, a cacophony of whispering voices and faint scratching noises that seemed to follow us no matter where we went. It felt like the entire hotel had come alive, aware of our presence, as if it was feeding off our fear. We reached our rooms, but as soon as we stepped inside, the temperature plunged. The heat from the day had disappeared entirely, and the air had become so cold it burned in my lungs with every breath. My hands trembled as I turned on the lights, but they flickered erratically before shutting off completely. It was pitch black, and the weight in the room became unbearable. Something was moving around us, unseen, but its presence was undeniable. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room felt smaller, closing in, and for the first time, I realized how hopeless we were. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were trapped. The door slammed shut behind us. It was so forceful that it shook the walls, causing the entire room to vibrate with the impact. Panic set in as I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I backed away, eyes darting around, desperate for an escape. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if someone, was moving within the room. Then, as though summoned by the very thoughts in my mind, the lights flickered back on. But it wasn't the comforting, warm light we had come to expect. Instead, it was a sickly, greenish way, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. The floor seemed to pulse beneath us, like a heartbeat reverberating from the very ground. The door at the far end of the room creaked open. We all turned, frozen in place. The room seemed to breathe with a life of its own. There was something beyond that door, something we weren't meant to see, and yet it was calling to us. I stepped forward, my feet moving of their own accord, drawn to the doorway. It wasn't just fear now, it was something else, something far darker. My heart was racing, and yet I felt compelled to go to see what lay behind the door. My friends stood frozen, but I couldn't turn back. Something inside me urged me to keep moving, and before I knew it, I had crossed the threshold. As I stepped through, I was hit with a blast of cold air that made my skin crawl. The room beyond was like nothing I had ever seen. It was the same hallway we had discovered earlier, but it was different. The walls were covered in what looked like dark, viscous fluid, dripping slowly down the sides, pooling on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the faint sound of scratching echoed from the walls. But what struck me most was the shape at the far end of the hall. It was tall, towering, and humanoid, but its form was distorted, like something that didn't belong in our world. Its outline shimmered as though it were made of smoke, and it moved unnaturally, its limbs twisting and bending in ways they shouldn't. It was an abomination of nature, a creature that shouldn't exist. It seemed to notice us then, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light that pierced through the darkness. I froze, my body unwilling to move, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. The figure's gaze was locked on me, and I could feel its eyes burrowing into my soul. It was watching, waiting, and then, without warning, it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was low, guttural, and filled with the same unearthly static that had permeated the building since we arrived. It was like the very air vibrated with its words, as though the words themselves were too heavy to be contained by the human mind. "Leave this place." The words didn't come from its mouth. They seemed to echo around the room, reverberating from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, only that they were inside my head, tearing through my thoughts. They shook me to the core, and I felt my body trembling with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the thing in front of me. The room grew darker, colder, and the air became so thick that I could barely breathe. The figure started to move toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it wasn't sure of its own existence. With each step, the ground seemed to shudder beneath us, and the walls closed in, narrowing the hallway until there was nowhere to run. I tried to scream, to call out to my friends, but the sound caught in my throat. I couldn't form words, couldn't make a sound. All I could do was watch as the figure closed the distance, its presence now overwhelming. And then, it was right in front of me. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the oppressive weight of its existence pressing in on me, suffocating me. Its face was a blur, distorted and shifting, like a broken reflection in a shattered mirror. It reached out, its hand stretching toward me, fingers elongating as if to grab hold of me, to pull me into the abyss with it. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever was to come. But instead of pain, there was only silence. I opened my eyes again. The figure was gone. The room was empty. I was standing in the hallway, breathing heavily, my chest heaving with the effort. My friends stood behind me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear, but none of us spoke. We didn't need to. The truth was undeniable. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a manifestation of the hotel's dark past. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for us. We had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The silence that followed the encounter was deafening, yet it was a silence that seemed to linger in the very air around us, heavy with the weight of the unimaginable. We stood there, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The creature, whatever it was, had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but the eerie feeling of its presence, its malice that still clung to the room like a suffocating fog. I looked at my friends, their faces pale, their bodies trembling as they backed away from the hallway. None of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. The horrors we had witnessed, the things that had been lurking just beneath the surface of our perception, were now undeniable. We had thought we were investigating a simple mystery, but now we understood the truth. This hotel, this place, was not something that could be understood by mere logic or reason. It was something far older, far darker than anything we had ever encountered. Finally, it was as if the weight of the moment broke us from our paralysis. I found my voice, though it came out weak and broken. "We need to leave. Now." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a desperate plea. We didn't need to discuss it. None of us dared to stay another moment in that forsaken place. The fear that had gripped us so tightly began to take form again, urging us to leave, to flee as far from this place as possible. We turned and stumbled back down the hallway, our footsteps loud in the silence, as if the building itself was listening, waiting. As we approached the stairs, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The faint outline of what looked like bloodstains on the steps, as though someone or something had been dragged up or down them. The dark red marks seemed to shift before my eyes, as if they were alive, as if they were changing with every passing second. I couldn't look away, but I forced myself to turn, to keep moving. We reached the front door, but when we tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. Panic rose up inside me again, a knot of terror tightening in my chest. The door was locked, but there was no lock. No reason why it wouldn't open. It was as if something, or someone, was preventing us from leaving. "Come on, open," I shouted, pounding on the door, but the words felt meaningless. There was no sound, no force that could make the door move. One of my friends grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "No, don't touch it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It won't let us go." I turned to look at him, and I saw the fear in his eyes, raw and unfiltered. The fear we had all been suppressing had now burst forth, and it was impossible to deny that we were trapped in a place that seemed to feed on our terror. In that moment, I knew we had to leave the hotel, but how? The entity, the presence that we had encountered, wasn't something we could just escape from. It was tied to the building, to the very fabric of the place. And somehow, we were tied to it too. A distant noise broke my thoughts, a faint thudding sound, like footsteps above us. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively turned to face the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. Someone, or something, was coming down the stairs. My friends, already frozen in place, looked up too. The footsteps grew louder, and with each step, the oppressive feeling in the air seemed to intensify. The temperature dropped even further, and the familiar groaning of the old building sounded louder now, more urgent, as if it was reacting to whatever was descending from above. I moved to the side, pulling my friends with me, trying to find some way to hide, to escape. We crouched down behind the furniture in the lobby, hearts pounding, breath shallow. The footsteps grew louder still, and then there it was. The figure. It appeared in the doorway, its silhouette sharp against the dim light of the hallway. The same figure we had seen earlier, but now it was no longer just a vague presence in the shadows. It was fully formed, solid. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its limbs elongating and twisting as it glided into the room, not walking but floating, hovering just above the ground. It didn't look directly at us, but I could feel its gaze, that icy, piercing presence that seemed to reach into the depths of my very being. The air grew colder, and the oppressive force that had been looming over us seemed to magnify, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. We remained silent, hiding behind the furniture, praying that it wouldn't see us, that it would simply move on. But it didn't. It stopped in the center of the room, its form rippling, flickering in and out of existence, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. Then, without warning, it tilted its head, as if listening. The stillness was unbearable. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, disappeared into the air, leaving nothing but the lingering coldness in its wake. It was gone, but the fear didn't leave with it. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For what felt like hours, none of us moved, none of us spoke. We sat in the frozen silence, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The hotel seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, was waiting. Finally, I spoke, my voice shaky but clear. "We have to get out. Now." I reached for the door again, more desperately this time, and to my surprise, it opened. It swung open with ease, as if whatever force had held it closed had finally released its grip. We didn't hesitate. We didn't look back. We rushed outside, into the cold night air, and didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our car. As we drove away from the hotel, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. None of us spoke for the entire ride. We didn't need to. The events that had unfolded were too horrifying, too incomprehensible to put into words. The terror we had felt, the horror of what we had seen, was something that could never be explained. We left the hotel behind us, but the memories, those memories, would never leave us. The darkness, the entity, the chilling presence of the hotel, it would haunt us in our dreams, in our waking hours. We didn't know what the hotel had been or what it had wanted from us, but one thing was certain. We would never speak of it again. The hotel had won. We didn't speak much after leaving the hotel, and for weeks, it was as if the experience had left an indelible mark on us, a weight that we could never quite shake. The fear, the images, the sense of being watched, it all clung to us in ways we didn't expect. The memories, those horrifying fragments, followed us into our daily lives, like shadows that would never fade. As the days passed, the rational part of my mind tried to reason with the experience. Maybe it had been some kind of shared hallucination, a product of fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. That place, that hotel, was something beyond comprehension. It was as if it had tapped into something far darker, something far older than anything we could understand. We all went our separate ways, but the bond we shared through that terrifying ordeal remained. There were unspoken words between us, glances that said more than any conversation could. The hotel had changed us, not in the way we had hoped, but in a way that left scars, ones that would linger forever. The events had shattered any sense of normalcy we once had. There was a part of us that couldn't forget, a part that was afraid to confront what we had truly witnessed. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when I was alone, I would replay the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. What was it? Was it a spirit, an entity, or something else entirely? The truth was that I would never know, but the chilling feeling, the sense of being hunted, never truly left me. It hung in the air like a constant reminder that some places are better left unexplored. The nightmares began soon after. They weren't constant, but when they came, they were vivid, always of the same thing. That entity, moving in and out of the shadows, its presence suffocating, its form shifting, never fully defined. I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, as if it knew me in a way that made my skin crawl. Sometimes I would wake up gasping for breath, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to me, the oppressive weight of it lingering in the air around me. I tried to brush it off, tried to tell myself that I was being paranoid. But then, one night, the power went out in my apartment. I remember walking through the darkened hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I felt that same sense of dread creeping up my spine, a sensation that was both familiar and utterly terrifying. I stood there, listening to the silence when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. My heart began to race, my breath shallow. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as I turned the corner, my eyes landed on something that made my blood run cold. The shape, the figure, was there, just as I had seen it in the hotel. It didn't look at me, didn't move. It was simply there, standing in the shadows, waiting. My stomach twisted, and I felt the terror rise within me, just as it had that night. I blinked, and it was gone. But I wasn't sure if it was ever really gone. I couldn't be certain anymore. I spoke to the others, my friends who had been there with me, but none of us were willing to admit what we truly felt. None of us wanted to confront the possibility that the hotel hadn't let us go, that it had followed us, that the darkness we had encountered in that place was not bound by the walls of the hotel, but had somehow attached itself to us. Years passed, and life continued in its usual rhythm. But the hotel, its horrors, remained a distant memory, a place I tried to forget. Yet, every now and then, when I walked past an old, abandoned building, or stayed in a hotel that seemed too quiet, too still, I couldn't help but wonder if it was the same. I would think back to that night and remember the cold, oppressive air of the place, the strange sensations, the figure that had haunted our every step. I once returned to the town where the hotel had been, curious, perhaps a little too curious. The building was gone, replaced by something newer, more modern. I walked past the empty lot, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of the hotel, no trace of its sinister presence. It felt as though the place had never existed at all, as though it had been swallowed by time and forgotten by the world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somewhere, waiting. Maybe it was just a feeling, a memory. Or maybe the hotel wasn't gone at all. Maybe it had simply moved on, found another place to haunt, another set of souls to torment. No one would ever believe our story, and even if they did, no one would understand. There were no answers, no explanations. All we were left with were questions, unanswered, unresolved. And that, in itself, was the true horror. The knowledge that some things in this world cannot be understood, and that sometimes they follow you, no matter how far you run. I still have nightmares about that place. Sometimes in my sleep, I hear the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming from the shadows. And every time, I wake up gasping for breath, my heart pounding, the fear lingering long after I've opened my eyes. I suppose that's what truly haunts me, that no matter where I go, no matter how much time passes, I will never truly escape it. The hotel, its presence, is always there, lingering in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to return. It was a quiet summer evening when I first arrived at the old lighthouse. You know the kind of place I mean, weathered by years of harsh coastal winds, standing tall at the edge of the world where the sea meets the sky. The kind of place that, when you look at it from a distance, you wonder about the stories it could tell if it could only speak. But this wasn't just a lighthouse, it was a legend in its own right, known to few, feared by many. I never believed in the ghost stories, at least, I didn't until I spent that night there. I was a photographer, always chasing that perfect shot, that unique angle that nobody else had ever captured. My friends would call me crazy, saying I would venture to the most remote, forgotten places, just for the sake of a good picture. And when I heard about this lighthouse, abandoned for years, sitting atop a cliff on a remote stretch of coastline, I couldn't resist. It was an untouched piece of history, waiting to be documented. Little did I know, I wasn't the only one interested in it. I had been invited by a local historian, someone who had an interest in preserving the lighthouse's history, despite its eerie reputation. I had no idea who he was, just some name passed along through an acquaintance. His invitation came out of nowhere, asking me to accompany him on a journey to photograph and document the lighthouse. It sounded like an exciting opportunity until I learned more about the man who had called me. The historian, a man in his late 50s, had spent years researching the lighthouse past. He spoke of its glory days, of ships that relied on its beacon, and of the tragic events that took place there. Some whispered that the lighthouse had been abandoned after the disappearance of its last keeper. But there were other stories, darker ones, stories of voices in the wind, cold drafts in rooms with no windows, and strange figures seen at the top of the tower, even though no one was supposed to be there. I wasn't particularly superstitious. I shrugged off these tales, chalking them up to local folklore. It wasn't uncommon for people to invent ghost stories to make a place more mysterious. But the historian, he was different. There was a weight to his words, a sense of urgency in his tone. He warned me not to stay after dark, to be cautious, to respect the lighthouse's history. When we arrived at the base of the lighthouse, the sun had already begun to dip below the horizon. The air was thick with salt, the sound of crashing waves against jagged rocks echoing in the distance. The structure loomed ahead, its stone walls weathered and cracked, a lighthouse that had stood there for more than a century, standing watch over the treacherous coast. As we made our way inside, the heavy wooden door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty structure. The smell of damp wood and mildew hit me immediately, but I wasn't bothered. We had work to do. The historian's goal was to gather records, old photographs, and documents, hoping to piece together the lighthouse's forgotten history. My task was to capture it all, every room, every angle, every artifact, before the place deteriorated further. The interior was as you might expect from a place left to decay over time. Dust settled thick on every surface, old furniture rotting away, and the faint scent of something long dead lingered in the air. Yet, it wasn't as unpleasant as it could have been. It had an odd charm, the kind that made you feel as if time had forgotten the place entirely. The historian set off to his corner, rifling through papers and old books in the dim light, while I set up my camera and began snapping photos of the lighthouse's many forgotten corners. The light coming through the tall, narrow windows cast long shadows on the floor, and as I adjusted the settings on my camera, I couldn't help but feel a certain heaviness in the air. The silence was almost oppressive, and the air itself felt thicker than it should have been. I tried to shake it off, just a trick of the light, I thought. But as the evening wore on and the sky outside grew darker, I began to notice something odd. The historian's movements became slower, more deliberate, and his eyes darted around the room like he was constantly on guard. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation getting to him or something else. We hadn't planned on staying long, just enough to gather the information we needed. But as the night grew colder and the wind howled outside, we found ourselves reluctant to leave. Something about the lighthouse kept us there, like an invisible force was holding us in place. The historian became more animated, talking faster now, telling me everything he knew about the place, warning me to stay close and to avoid certain rooms. It was then that I learned about the last keeper, a man who was said to have gone mad before disappearing one stormy night. No one knew what happened to him, but some believed that his spirit still haunted the lighthouse, trapped between the walls. We agreed to leave before nightfall, but I had a strange feeling about the place. Despite the historian's growing discomfort, I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, almost as if the lighthouse was calling me in a way I couldn't explain. Something deep inside me told me I was about to learn a lot more than I bargained for. And that, my friends, is how it all began, how the calm before the storm, the quiet before the chaos came to be. Now that you know a bit about the place, let me take you deeper into the events that followed. As the last light of the evening slipped away, leaving the lighthouse in shadows, the atmosphere around us seemed to shift. The wind outside howled, pushing against the stone walls as though it wanted to tear the building apart. The historian had finally stopped talking, his back stiff as he sat near the small fireplace, which had long since gone cold. He was staring into the darkness, his eyes narrowed, as if he could see something I couldn't. I thought it was just the growing isolation getting to him, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling creeping down my spine. I continued taking photographs, moving around the lighthouse to capture its decay, each click of the camera shutter sounding louder in the quiet room. The lighthouse had an eerie, hollow quality about it that no amount of photographic equipment could truly convey. My lens captured the spaces between time, but something about the place felt so much more than that. The strange, oppressive air grew heavier with each passing minute. There was an unsettling sensation in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't explain, an instinct that told me something wasn't quite right. I tried to push the feeling aside, attributing it to the isolation of being in such a remote, ancient place. But then, as I was setting up for another shot near the top of the staircase that led to the tower, it happened. At first, it was a simple sound, like the soft scrape of a chair leg against the floor. But there was no chair in the room. I froze, my camera mid-position, staring at the spot where the noise had come from. The historian didn't react, his eyes still focused on the small pile of papers in front of him, but there was something different about his expression. His face was pale, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "Did you hear that?" I asked quietly, my voice low enough so it wouldn't disturb the stillness of the room. He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice was strained, almost too soft to hear. "I heard it," he said, his words hanging in the air like a warning. But he didn't move. He didn't look at me. Instead, he turned his attention back to the paper in front of him, his eyes flicking over the lines, with a kind of urgency that made me feel more on edge than before. I felt my heart beat a little faster, but I pushed the sensation away, telling myself that the sound could have been anything, a shifting floorboard, the house settling, or even the wind blowing through cracks in the walls. The room was getting colder. I could feel it in the air around me, like a deep, biting chill that seeped into my skin. I glanced up at the old, cracked windows, expecting to see the remnants of the day's light slipping through, but there was nothing. The moon had risen, and it was casting a faint glow through the dirty panes, leaving only shadows dancing on the floor. Everything was still, too still. I made my way back to the historian, unsure of what I wanted to say. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. Do you think the lighthouse could be haunted?" I asked hesitantly, the question feeling strange in my mouth as soon as I spoke it. I wasn't someone who usually believed in that kind of thing, but the air was so thick with unease that it felt like there was something pressing down on my chest, something that had followed me inside. The historian didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the papers in his hands. Then, slowly, he lifted his head to meet my eyes. His gaze was uncomfortably intense, as if he were debating something within himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Maybe it's not about belief," he said, his words coming with a heavy weight. "Maybe it's about the things you can't explain. There's something in this place, something tied to its past. And it doesn't like visitors." Before I could respond, the temperature dropped even further. A cold draft swept through the room, sending shivers up my spine. I looked around, trying to find a source, but the windows were all shut tight, the doors locked. No draft should have been able to get in. Yet, there it was, a chill that seemed to originate from nowhere and spread throughout the room, leaving my breath visible in the air. "That's not possible," I muttered to myself, stepping back from the historian, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. A soft, metallic sound, a clang like something heavy being dropped on the stone floor above us, came from the tower. I froze. It was loud, unmistakable. The historian's eyes went wide, his hand gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He didn't move for a long moment. Neither of us said a word. The sound had been too deliberate, too precise, as though it was trying to get our attention. Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I intended. He nodded slowly, his face pale, his mouth set in a grim line. "It's just the wind," he said, but his voice was strained, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Just the wind," he repeated, but there was no conviction in his words. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there in the dim light, staring at the door to the tower above. The historian's words had lost their power to calm me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot by a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Then, without warning, the door to the tower creaked open. It was a slow, deliberate sound, as though someone was carefully pushing it open from the other side. Neither of us moved. I could feel my pulse thudding in my temples, my hands clammy with cold sweat. The historian's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He stood up slowly, his body stiff, as if unsure of what to do. "Don't go up there," he whispered. His voice cracked, and it was clear he was more afraid than he had let on. But I had already started moving. Something inside me was urging me forward. I wasn't sure if it was curiosity or something darker, but I couldn't just stand there. I had to see for myself what was happening. I slowly ascended the staircase, my steps creaking in the silence. The air grew colder the higher I went, and the weight of the building seemed to press down on me, suffocating me with its age and secrets. As I reached the top of the stairs, I found the door to the observation room ajar, just a crack, as though inviting me inside. I pushed it open, and immediately I felt the full force of the chill. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming through the dirty windows. There, in the corner of the room, sat an old chair, one that looked out of place in a place like this. It was overturned, as if someone had been sitting in it before being disturbed. And just beneath it, lying on the floor, was a small metal object. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I touched the cool, smooth surface of the object. It was a small, rusted key, no bigger than the palm of my hand, with intricate engravings on it that seemed to shimmer faintly in the low light. As soon as my fingers closed around it, I heard it a low, guttural sound, like someone was trying to speak, but the words were indistinguishable. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. Something was in the room with me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, still. But the feeling, the sensation, lingered. I was no longer alone. The days that followed our unsettling experience in the lighthouse were clouded with unease. Every time I tried to focus on the photographs I had taken, my mind would wander back to the tower, to the strange, cold feeling that gripped me as I picked up that rusted key. I couldn't shake the thought of it, the inexplicable weight of it, both physical and metaphorical. And the historian, he had hardly spoken since we left the lighthouse, his face pale, as though whatever had happened there had drained the life out of him. We spent the night in the small cabin nearby, where the air felt too thick to breathe, and the silence was unnervingly oppressive. The historian had taken a seat by the window, his gaze distant, but I knew his mind wasn't in the present. It was in that lighthouse, in the tower, where someone had waited for us. I tried to sleep, but the oppressive air seemed to follow me everywhere. Even as I lay in bed, eyes closed, the sensation of being watched gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. The hours stretched on, each minute filled with the sound of the wind howling through the trees outside. I could feel the house creaking beneath me, the floorboards shifting in ways that were too deliberate to be natural. But every time I opened my eyes, everything seemed just as it had been. And yet, it wasn't. The following morning, the fog that had rolled in the night before hadn't lifted. It hung low over the landscape, swirling around the edges of the lighthouse like a living thing, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. We couldn't even see the cliffs that we knew were just beyond the path. The air smelled damp and sour, like mildew and sea salt, as though the world itself had been swallowed by the fog. I decided to venture back to the lighthouse. I had to. Something was pulling me, a curiosity that bordered on obsession. I didn't want to admit it, but the truth was, I couldn't leave it behind. The key, the coldness, the strange noises. It was as though the lighthouse was calling to me, tugging at my thoughts, refusing to let go. I turned to the historian, who was sitting at the table, scribbling in a worn notebook. "I'm going back," I told him, my voice steady but firm. "I need to know what's happening." He didn't respond right away. His eyes flickered up to meet mine, but there was no emotion in them, just a hollow kind of resignation. "You shouldn't go alone," he said, his voice flat, his words heavy with something I couldn't place. But he didn't get up. He didn't stop me. It was as if he had given up on trying to stop the inevitable. The air outside had thickened further as I made my way to the lighthouse. With every step, the world felt smaller, as if the fog was closing in, pressing down on me from all sides. The wind had died down, leaving behind a stillness that was unnerving. The only sounds were my footsteps on the wet ground and the occasional creak of the lighthouse in the distance. As I approached the door, it stood open, just as it had the night before. I hesitated for a moment, standing in the threshold. The door groaned in protest as I pushed it open fully. The familiar musty scent hit me immediately, mixing with the dampness of the air. The atmosphere was heavier now, more oppressive. The silence felt wrong, like it was too complete, too perfect. Every step I took toward the tower was like walking deeper into a dream I couldn't wake up from. I wasn't alone. I knew it, even before I saw the subtle changes around me. The chair that had been overturned in the tower the day before, now it was right side up, positioned in the center of the room, as though someone had placed it there deliberately. The key, the one I had picked up, was missing. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from corner to corner, my heart pounding in my chest. It was then that I noticed it. The walls, which had once appeared to be aged and crumbling, now looked different. They were no longer just weathered, they were stained, as if something had seeped into the stones. The pattern was random, but unmistakable, a kind of dark, splotchy discoloration that seemed to creep up from the floor, like a stain that wouldn't come out. My breath caught in my throat as I traced the dark marks with my eyes. A slow, steady drip broke the silence. I turned toward the source, my body tense, every nerve screaming to flee. It was coming from the ceiling, dark, viscous drops falling from a crack in the stone. The air around me had grown colder again, and the chill bit at my skin, seeping into my bones. I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, as the dark liquid continued to fall, one drop after another, each one louder than the last. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. A shadow. But it wasn't my own. It moved, just out of the corner of my vision, as if it were following my every move. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive stillness of the room. I glanced over to the door, my mind screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. It was as though something was keeping me rooted to the spot, drawing me deeper into the darkness of the lighthouse. I took a cautious step forward, my breath shallow as I approached the staircase leading to the tower. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the wood beneath my feet sounding like a warning. The temperature dropped even further as I reached the top of the stairs. The door to the observation room was cracked open once again, the same eerie invitation it had given me the night before. This time, I couldn't resist. I pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the room was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The chair that had been overturned before was now righted again, and sitting in it was something. Someone. It was a figure cloaked in shadow, unmoving, as if it had been waiting for me. I froze, my body numb with fear, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't see its face. The shadows clung to it, obscuring everything but its outline. It sat perfectly still, its presence overwhelming the room. And then, as though it had sensed me, the figure began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. I couldn't breathe. My legs were shaking, my hands clammy, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The figure's head finally turned fully toward me, and I could feel its gaze, even though its face remained hidden in the darkness. The room seemed to close in around me. I reached for my camera, but my hands were trembling too much to steady it. The shadow's form shifted, like a wisp of smoke, and then it was gone. Vanished, as though it had never been there. The room felt empty again, but the chill remained. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the space where the figure had been. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. The force of it sent me stumbling backward, my heart racing as panic flooded through me. I rushed for the door, my hands grasping at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. From the other side, a deafening silence fell. Then, in the stillness, I heard something, a soft, dragging sound coming from the tower above. Someone, or something, was moving. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but there was no answer. No one was there. I couldn't breathe. Every breath felt thick, heavy in my lungs, as if the very air was pressing down on me. The door, still locked, was a cruel barrier between me and whatever waited outside. My body trembled, but I couldn't look away from the tower above me. The dragging sound was getting closer, closer with every passing second. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. The chilling cold in the room seemed to deepen, suffocating, as if it were being pulled from the very walls themselves. My fingers grasped the door handle in a desperate attempt to turn it again, to break free, but it remained firmly in place, as though mocking my every effort. Then, the dragging sound stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. The thick fog outside crept under the door like fingers, curling its dampness into the room. I could feel it, see it in the way the air shimmered around me. But then I heard a voice. Soft, barely audible at first. Just a whisper, but it was enough to freeze me in place. It came from above me, from the tower. Help! The word was low, hoarse, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. I stood, frozen, eyes wide, scanning the empty room around me. The room that felt anything but empty. Another whisper, this time louder, more distinct. Help me. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking uncontrollably, my knees threatening to give way beneath me. My body was on the edge, ready to collapse from the fear coursing through my veins. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't turn away. That voice, it wasn't like any human voice I'd ever heard. It was cracked, broken, and it was calling for something. For help. But there was no one to help. No one but me. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my ears as I looked at the locked door once again. What was I supposed to do? What could I possibly do? My thoughts were spiraling into a dark abyss of panic, but deep down, I knew I couldn't stay trapped here forever. I couldn't leave that voice unanswered. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I made my way to the staircase, each step echoing through the silence. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, driven by a force I couldn't explain. Something in me, something primal, was urging me to find the source of that voice, to face whatever it was head on. As I ascended, the air grew even colder, more suffocating. The silence was broken only by my footsteps, the creak of the floorboards beneath me. Each movement felt deliberate, like the house itself was watching, waiting. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped. The observation room door was wide open now, the same dark shadow swirling just inside the doorway. I could feel it, the pull, drawing me in, despite every rational thought telling me to turn around, to leave. The whispers continued, but they weren't just words anymore. They were becoming more frantic, more desperate. The figure in the chair, the one that had vanished moments ago, was back. But this time, it wasn't alone. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My eyes refused to focus, unable to make sense of the grotesque scene before me. The figure in the chair was now surrounded by others, shadowed forms, hunched and distorted, their features obscured by the darkness. They shifted, moved in a way that was unnatural, jerky, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. The air hummed with an energy that felt as though it was building to a crescendo, something ancient and powerful, something that was just beyond the reach of my understanding. But it wasn't the shadows that held my attention. No, it was the figure in the chair, the one whose face was finally visible. And when I saw it, the world seemed to tilt. The face was hollow, empty, a grotesque mockery of humanity. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone, like a mask that had been torn from something far darker. It was staring at me, or at least I thought it was, its blank face sending a chill through every fiber of my being. And then it spoke. The voice that had been calling for help, the one I had heard echoing through the tower, came from the figure in the chair. But this time, it was different. It was distorted, guttural, as though the words were being dragged out of some unspeakable depth. Help me. The words echoed in my skull, reverberating through my mind like a terrible song that wouldn't stop playing. I felt my legs give out beneath me, my body slumping against the cold stone wall for support. My throat was dry, my breath shallow. I was trembling, no, shaking, uncontrollably now. It was then that I saw them. The figures around the chair were moving closer, inching toward me with every step. The sound of their dragging feet was like nails on a chalkboard, sharp and jarring. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, my mind locked in a vice of terror. My heart was pounding in my chest, a frantic rhythm that I could feel in every inch of my body. But no matter how much I wanted to run, to flee, I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in a nightmare that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. The room seemed to stretch, to warp around me. The walls, once solid and unmoving, were now closing in, twisting, bending in unnatural ways. The shadows were thickening, pooling in the corners like something alive, something hungry. I couldn't focus. My vision blurred, my mind unraveling under the weight of what I was witnessing. These figures, they weren't human. They couldn't be. The way they moved, the way they swayed, like puppets with no strings. It was as if they were remnants of something long forgotten, something ancient and twisted. The chair creaked, groaned as it slowly turned. The hollow face was now directed straight at me, and I could feel its presence like a physical force. It wasn't just looking at me. It was inside me, burrowing into my mind, pulling at the very core of my being. And then, in a voice that was both deafening and silent, it whispered, "You should have left when you had the chance." The words echoed through my mind, reverberating in every corner of my consciousness. It was like the room was speaking, the very walls pushing in on me, urging me to listen. But there was no escape. There would be no running. I woke up with a start, my body jolting upright, breath ragged and shallow. For a moment, everything was still. The air was heavy, thick with the remnants of fear, and I could feel it lingering, pressing down on me like a weight. My mind was a fog of confusion, the events of the night before swirling in fragments, disconnected memories that seemed almost too impossible to believe. The darkness that had surrounded me, the hollow face, had it all been a dream? No, it couldn't have been. I rubbed my eyes, trying to push away the lingering effects of that nightmare. But as my gaze drifted around the room, I froze. The lighthouse was exactly as it had been, silent, oppressive, and cold. The once thick fog outside had dissipated, leaving a crisp, clear sky. But the stillness of the place was unsettling, almost too perfect, as if it were waiting for something. Or someone. I swallowed hard. The air was still saturated with the energy of something dark, something that wasn't quite finished. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse wasn't done with me yet, that whatever forces resided here were merely biding their time. I stood up slowly, my limbs stiff, and stumbled toward the door. There was no trace of the figures or the shadowy forms I'd seen last night, no sign of the twisted figure that had tormented me. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. Had I really escaped? Or had it only been a temporary reprieve? I reached for the handle, the cool metal biting into my palm, and twisted it open. The air outside the lighthouse felt different, brighter, but still cold. It was as if the world beyond was untouched by the horrors I had witnessed. But as my feet hit the ground, a thought struck me with terrifying clarity. The lighthouse was no longer simply a structure. It was a part of me, a dark, unshakable part that I could never leave behind. I had to leave. There was no way I could stay here any longer. With a sense of urgency I hadn't felt before, I turned and hurried back down the stairs. Every step felt like a reminder of everything that had happened, everything I had seen. The figures, the whispers, the hollow face that had haunted me. My heart raced, a constant, relentless pounding in my chest. The room where I'd seen the figure in the chair was silent now. The chair sat empty, its wood groaning in the stillness, as if mocking me for my inability to escape. I looked around the room one last time, the shadows that had once seemed alive now motionless, as though they were waiting for me to leave. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I didn't want to feel it anymore. I moved toward the door, hands trembling as I grabbed the handle, but something stopped me, a cold breath against the back of my neck. I froze. The air shifted again, and the whispers began, low and insistent, curling around my thoughts. The words were unintelligible at first, but then they grew louder, clearer, until I could hear them directly in my ear. Why didn't you help me? I couldn't breathe. The voice was not just inside my head, it was in the room with me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The room was still empty. No shadowy figures, no grotesque face staring at me from the chair. Nothing. But I could still hear the whispers, feel them pressing in from all sides. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The door was just a few steps away, but every inch felt like a mile. Leave, the voice whispered again, and this time it was different. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a plea. It was a command. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to reach the door. I pulled it open with a force that surprised even me, stumbling out into the cold, fresh air of the morning. The lighthouse stood behind me, its silhouette stark against the rising sun, as if nothing had happened. I looked back one last time, my mind racing. What had just occurred? Was it real? Was any of it real? My hand clenched around the doorframe as the silence of the world outside swallowed the last remnants of the nightmare I had experienced. I didn't feel free, not yet. The question lingered, haunting me even as I turned away from the lighthouse and walked toward the distant road. I walked for hours, never stopping, not once looking back. The further I got, the more the weight seemed to lift from my shoulders. But still, deep down, I knew that the lighthouse wasn't finished with me. It would never be finished with me. And I was left with a lingering, terrible truth. The lighthouse was more than just a building. It was a doorway to something much darker, something I couldn't fully comprehend. And as much as I tried to leave it behind, to forget the horrors I had faced within its walls, I knew that the shadows of that place would follow me forever. The days passed in a blur. I tried to bury the memories, to return to a normal life, but the shadows never quite left me. I could still hear the whispers in the dark, could still feel the weight of those hollow eyes, watching me from some distant, forgotten place. The images were seared into my mind, the terror etched into my very soul. And the voice, it kept calling. Why didn't you help me? But no matter how much I wanted to forget, I knew that the true horror wasn't what I had seen. The true horror was that the lighthouse had never let me leave. It was still inside me, always. Some nights, when the wind howls and the world is silent except for the rhythmic pounding of my heart, I wonder if it was real. I wonder if the terror I felt in that place was something born from my own mind, or if something truly dark resides within the walls of that lighthouse. Could it have been something as simple as the isolation playing tricks on me, or was it something more? I've tried asking the locals, the ones who still live near the shore, about the lighthouse. The ones who've lived here for generations. They speak in hushed tones when it comes up, their eyes darting away, avoiding the subject as if it's a conversation they don't want to have. Some of them refuse to even acknowledge it exists. They tell me it's been abandoned for years, that no one has lived there in decades. But the truth? The truth is something they don't speak of, something I'm not sure I'm ready to face. The last time I saw the lighthouse, it was no different from the first time I set eyes on it. Majestic, foreboding, silent. Yet, even from a distance, I could feel the pull of it, like it was still watching me, waiting for me to return. I know I should never go back. I know it. But the urge is there, a whisper that nags at the edge of my thoughts, a calling that only seems to grow louder with time. I've heard rumors, small, fleeting whispers from people who come and go. Some claim they've seen figures moving around the lighthouse, figures they couldn't explain. Others have heard strange sounds coming from within, like the wind speaking through the cracks in the building's walls. But no one dares to go near. And why would they? After all, who would willingly face something like that? But the hardest part? The hardest part is that the question still haunts me. Was it all in my head, or did the lighthouse really do something to me? Can I ever escape it? Can I ever forget? The deeper I search for answers, the more elusive they become. The lighthouse is a mystery with no solution, and it's one that will never let me go. In the quiet of the night, I hear it again, the whisper. Why didn't you help me? But now, it doesn't seem like a question at all. It feels more like an accusation. A haunting reminder that whatever happened there, whatever darkness I stumbled into, will never release me. I have learned to live with the fear, to pretend it isn't there, lurking in the recesses of my mind. I've moved on with my life, but the lighthouse is never far from my thoughts. The memory of it is ingrained in me. It's become part of who I am, whether I like it or not. As I sit here, at the edge of the world, I realize something. The lighthouse didn't just take something from me. It gave me something too. A truth that I can never ignore, no matter how much I want to. The truth is that some places aren't meant to be understood. Some things, some darkness, are far too ancient to be comprehended. The lighthouse was never just a structure. It was a test, a challenge to face what lies in the unseen corners of our minds. And for whatever reason, I was the one who found it. I suppose in some twisted way, the lighthouse is still with me. And perhaps it always will be. Even now, I can feel it deep inside, that cold, unyielding presence. It's not finished with me. Not yet. So here I am, trying to make sense of a world that no longer feels quite as safe. Trying to move forward, knowing that there are places that exist just beyond the veil of reality, that hold a darkness that we will never truly understand. And despite all the fear, despite all the terror, I know one thing for sure.